Ladies and gentlemen, today is January the 8th, 2023. Year of our Lord. And we're going to talk about the world. A friend of mine, Agent Smith, codename, is going to talk to us about current events, foreign policy, and economics. This is a live and breathing discussion, so if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the chat or rage at us from the YouTube comments. Without further ado, we have Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Solid. Strong. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Did you have a good New Year?
Yeah. Visited my family in South Dakota.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had a last minute, they flew me out Christmas Day, and I was stuck in Denver airport for 5 hours. It was pretty cool, but I made it there, and I stayed for about a week. I had New Year's there. It was pretty snowy and cold, but we did some fun stuff, like went down into this huge cave network called Wind Cave. It's like the third largest in the world. And then, yeah, the axe throwing was really fun. Also ran around outside with the dogs. We shot a bow and arrow. It was a good time.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. It was nice to be off camera for a little bit after the subathon.
Oh, yeah, that wrapped up, didn't it?
Yep, we made it 19 days. I had a 21-day cap on it, so we made it almost all the way.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Pretty successful endeavor, then.
Massively successful. I thought I would get to 5 days. So 19 is more than 5. Math checks out.
Congratulations.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a good New Year and stuff?
Yeah, it was very quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Got to see some alpacas.
Did they come to your house, or did you go see them?
Oh, they were at my aunt's place out in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody really knows why she got them, but they were there. So I got to see some alpacas up close and personal.
From what I've heard, they fill a similar role to donkeys, where they're very territorial and they're good at guarding other livestock animals. So if you have chickens or goats or cows or any other type of creature that's a little bit more vulnerable, alpacas are just kind of territorial and mean. So you're less likely to get those messed with.
Yeah, the issue there, though, is that she already has donkeys, so I don't know why she would want more protection. I don't think she has all that many problems with coyotes and whatnot.
She's in Texas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not about protection from coyotes, it's about protection from the government.
Well, there is that. There is that.
You think the government's going to go knock on her door when she has donkey and alpaca defense? No way. It's too risky.
It's quite a bit of deterrence.
And you get a couple more signs of the apocalypse, invest in an ostrich or two. Add those to the property.
There you go.
Then you're bulletproof. Well, I haven't followed the news too much while I was away, but I did see one item which maybe it's not as funny as I thought, but it seemed funny to me. The Bolsonaro fans stormed the Brazilian Congress or something, but they weren't in session, so it was different from the January 6th event in that nobody was home to harass or try to chase down.
Yeah, Lula da Silva has already been inaugurated, so he is already president. In the case of the January 6th unrest here in the United States, there's a widespread presumption that they were attempting to try to disrupt the transition of power because they actually assailed, so to speak, Congress while they were trying to count the electoral votes. And if they had managed to disrupt that, it may have led to the vote being discredited and potentially kicked back to state legislatures. At least that was the allegation at the time. So with Brazil, though, today, none of that was in play. Like, the transition of power had already occurred. So this was really more of just a expression of discontent, if you like. Near as I can tell, if there was some strategic underpinning to it, I don't see it. But then I
Mhm.
don't follow Brazilian politics too closely, so maybe I'm missing something.
So you don't think these actions will really accomplish much?
I doubt it. I mean, somebody from Brazil would know better than I would, but it really doesn't seem like there's any kind of overarching strategic objective behind the protests. And
Mhm.
like you mentioned, there wasn't anybody there. It wasn't just Congress. Uh, it wasn't just the congressional building, rather, that they attacked or entered or whatever. They also seized the Supreme Court and also the presidential palace. So they were quite active today, in the capital, Brasilia, but nobody was in any of them. Congress is in recession. Lula rather, is traveling right now. And I don't think the Supreme Court is working right now either. So it was a lot of noise, but it didn't seem to really signify much.
Mhm.
And the police cleared them out, eventually. They were a bit overwhelmed at first, but eventually they were able to rally and eventually use tear gas and other methods to eject them from the buildings that they had illegally entered.
Mhm.
So lots of dramatic footage, but it doesn't seem like it's going to result in anything other than a lot of people being very upset.
And they weren't like maybe as equipped as the January 6th people.
I don't know about that. I'm sure that there were some who were.
Mhm.
The Brazilian Bolsonaro supporters can be, just as dedicated as their Trumpian equivalents here in the United States. So I don't doubt that there were at least some who
Mhm.
were prepared for the eventuality that occurred today. But yeah, again, it just doesn't seem to have had a lot of strategic impetus to it. There
Mhm.
wasn't anything they seemed to be really going for. So it'll just kind of be a one-off, pretty much. Although it's worth pointing out that stuff like this has kind of been happening for a while. This is obviously the most dramatic manifestation of discontent by Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil, but they've been protesting ever since the election, ever since it was clear that Bolsonaro had lost. You may remember a couple months ago the trucker protests in Brazil,
Mhm.
kind of similar to the trucker protests in Canada almost, blocking highways, protesting out in the streets, what have you.
Mhm.
And there's also been attempts to protest in front of army barracks.
Mhm.
Apparently, they've been trying to appeal to the army to stop the transition of power and maybe even seize power themselves in order to ensure that Lula doesn't become president. None of that worked, but there was some attempt anyway. So that's all been going on for months now. So this is sort of well, maybe not the culmination. Maybe there's more to come, who's to say? But it's not necessarily surprising. Bolsonaro had kind of been hinting over time, well before the election, that he might try something to stay in power. Ultimately, it seems he did not. But at the same time, the fact that his supporters are kind of going all out here, no surprise. People were kind of expecting something like this. In fact, this is probably much more tame than what some of the pessimists had been expecting. So thus far, things are still, well within controllable parameters.
Mhm.
Yeah, Bolsonaro, for his part, was kind of expected to try to discredit the election. He'd been making noise about election machines and talking about how they were easy to hack and whatnot, and he wanted to shift over. What was it? I think it was he wanted to shift away from electronic voting machines to paper voting. So that was kind of foreshadowing, or at least that was seen as foreshadowing for some kind of attempt, if he lost, to try to discredit the election outcome by pointing to some kind of imagined election fraud and then using that as an excuse to stay in power. But as was, he ended up not doing anything, really. He was very quiet on election day and ended up ceding power. He did
Mhm.
not concede the election. He still has not done that. But he did give up power, and currently he's eating chicken in Florida.
Yeah, I heard about that. Just chilling in Florida,
Yep.
looking a lot less guilty of whatever. Inciting. What would you call this? Is this a insurgency, rebellion, riot?
Eh, protest, violent protest, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know that it was all that violent, but maybe I'm wrong. They did attack police. I do know that much.
Mm.
So you could call it violent in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, without any, I mean, again, with January 6th here in the United States, there was an actual procedure happening when they attacked. And a lot of people involved with that action were trying to disrupt that process in a way they thought would be favorable to their preferred candidate.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there was actually something of a plan. Not everybody was in on the plan. You know, January 6th was not like an entirely planned thing. There were sort of vague notions that they could maybe impact the outcome, but I don't get the impression there was necessarily much actual planning outside of a few radicals. But in this case, again, you know, the buildings were empty, transition of power already happened. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any real impetus to it beyond an expression of discontent. So in that sense, more of a protest than an insurgency or rebellion or, you know, whatever you might call the January 6th event. So a bit different in that sense.
There was something I saw that was saying that the advisor to Bolsonaro is the same as the advisor to Trump. What was that about?
Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
What was it? Steve Bannon and Roger Stone, I think. Both of them have kind of been interacting with some of the Bolsonaro people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know how deeply involved they are. You know, Bannon doesn't seem like much of a planner. He's kind of more of an ideas guy from what I've read and seen of him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was involved with like Trump's presidential campaign, but he didn't stick around for the actual administration, at least not for very long. He was there for maybe like a couple weeks, maybe months before he ended up resigning / getting pushed out, depending on who you talk to.
Mm-hmm.
So as interested as he is in politics and as active as he is in politics, he doesn't really seem like an actual political player to me. He's more of a media guy, more of a media personality.
Yeah, trying to get more eyes on what's going on and get people traction rather than actually improving their political situation per se.
Yeah. So it wouldn't surprise me if he was in contact with some of Bolsonaro's people, but I doubt he has all that much influence. I'm sure Bolsonaro's team has their own characters of an equivalent variety.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, I did have some video from the Brazilian stuff today, so I just pulled that from Reddit. So I'll send that to you in chat. Or not chat, rather, but Discord. Let's see. Am I sending this to the right person? Yeah. Here we go. So it'll look pretty familiar.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the visuals are very similar to January 6th, but, you know, again, beyond that, there's some fundamental differences. Was there anything else that kind of caught your eye recently?
I don't think so. The UK banned plastic forks and plates. That's something. Environmentalists will cheer, maybe. Been kind of out of the loop for a lot of news recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Have you been following the McCarthy drama?
No. What's that about?
Oh, man. Okay. I got a story for you. So, I think his name is Steve McCarthy, whatever. His last name is McCarthy. And, you know, Democrats had controlled the House of Representatives up until, recently. You know, the Republicans were able to win more seats in the midterm election last November. So they were set to become the majority. Now, the majority party in the House of Representatives has to choose a House Speaker to basically organize the agenda and, you know, fulfill the other roles that the Speaker fulfills. And it was presumed that it would be McCarthy because he'd been, I believe, the minority speaker when the Republicans were in the minority in the House. Mm-hmm. So the vote was held, and it was assumed to be kind of a formality, but there was about 20 Republicans who were part of the Freedom Caucus. Those of you following American politics for the past 10, 20 years will remember them. They've been quite active. So the Freedom Caucus are very conservative. I mean, obviously, being Republicans, they're pretty conservative, but the Freedom Caucus is filled out by sort of a combination of libertarians and also some of the sort of more fringe Trumpy type people. You know, it's kind of an eclectic group. It's not very uniform, but basically their issue is that they didn't think McCarthy was conservative enough. And so they refused to vote for him in the vote for House Majority Leader. Now, you know, you always learn interesting things about a political system when shit goes wrong. So no different here. Apparently, there is a rule in the House of Representatives that nothing can be done until a House Majority Speaker has been elected. If a vote for House Majority Leader fails at the beginning of a session, then they're actually required to just continue having votes until they have somebody. I had no idea. And I don't think most people did, because here's the thing, from what I was reading, there has not been a failed vote for a House Majority Speaker in almost 100 years. From what I was reading, the last time this happened was in the 1920s. So this is an unusual event. And on the first day, I think there was something like 4 separate votes in which they tried to elect a House Majority Speaker, and all of them failed because McCarthy just didn't have the votes. And of course, you know, the dissidents, the 20 GOP reps who were voting against him, didn't really have an alternative in mind. They were mostly just trying to extract concessions of one kind or another. You know, I'll kind of go through the list here, but basically, this lasted for several days, and it's actually been a top news story. You know, if you'd been kind of reading, this would have been one of the headlines you'd read in the news or on Reddit even. I think it was something like 14 votes total, something like that, before they were able to finally get the majority they needed. So I think as of yesterday, a House Majority Leader has been selected, and they are going to be able to actually start the session.
And that's 14 votes, not as in 14 people voted, but 14 rounds of attempting to vote for someone?
Correct.
Wow. Who did they end up with?
Oh, McCarthy. It was never really in doubt. There was nobody else really running. Again, it was not about the person. It was about what you might call log rolling. You know, basically they were looking to trade. They wanted to trade their votes for some kind of concessions that would favor them. So some of the stuff that they have nominally gotten from McCarthy, because McCarthy had to promise them something, right, to get them on board. So one is that they're going to change the rules in the House so that there's a lower threshold in order to start a motion to vacate. So, you know, normally, for the past couple of years anyway, if somebody in the House of Representatives wanted to hold a vote to change the speaker, they would need 5 separate legislators to vote for that, you know, just to start it. And that doesn't sound like much, but it created, you know, a barrier to entry such that if you were House Speaker, then you had some room to maneuver, even if somebody really didn't like you. So what they're going to change it to is 1. So all it's going to take to start a motion to vacate is just 1 dude. So this is a concession that is meant to kind of keep McCarthy on a leash. You know, even though the Freedom Caucus is not really the majority, does not comprise a majority of Republicans in the House of Representatives, they can easily start a motion to vacate. And so that's going to be a threat that they can wield against McCarthy in order to ensure that they have relatively more leverage over him. So the implication then is that McCarthy is going to have to run the House relatively more conservatively than he would have otherwise in order to try to placate this dissident faction within the House Republican Party. And again, the motion to vacate thing, that's just one of the pieces of leverage that they're going to have, that he was required to give them, basically, or that he's going to be required to give them. They haven't actually changed the rules yet, but he has nominally promised.
Is this during the same set of stuff? I saw there was a headline of one of the dudes in there flipped a like racist hand sign or something. People were getting upset about that.
I don't remember reading about that.
Oh.
That's news to me.
That was one of the legislators.
There was a guy that tried to pick a fight with Matt Gaetz. I did see that. Kind of started shouting at him. Matt Gaetz was one of the Freedom Caucus guys who was voting against McCarthy. And so one of the senior Republicans in the House kind of approached him, started yelling at him, and another guy had to restrain him. So that video also made the rounds online and in the news.
Oh yeah, it's George Santos who did that hand symbol thing.
Let's see. McCarthy also had to promise to be a little more inclusive. So one of the trends in American politics over the past 10 years is that bills are not really negotiated and debated much anymore. These days, if there's a major bill, its contents are negotiated between party leaders quietly, kind of out of sight of the rank and file party members. And then they'll put it up for a vote and you're whipped into voting for it. Whipping is basically the sort of technical term for pushing people to vote for a bill. So both parties have there's a majority whip and then there's a minority whip. So the majority whip, of course, is the whip for the majority party in the House or the Senate. And then the minority whip is the corresponding whip for the minority party in one or the other house. And they're both responsible for trying to pressure people into voting for given bills. The degree to which they can do that, the leverage that they have with which to push people kind of varies from person to person and also from time period to time period. Right now, there's a little more leverage than there used to be just because it's, possible to threaten to primary somebody, which is a more credible threat now than it used to be.
What does it mean to primary somebody?
Well, are you familiar with primary elections, like in the United States? Yeah. So the idea there is that in the next election, they'll run somebody who's more radical than you. If you're a Republican, they'll put somebody who's more conservative. They'll support somebody who's more conservative than you in the primary election. Or if you're a Democrat, they'll support somebody who's more liberal / lefty, not more leftist, let's say, just broad term there. And the idea there is that because relatively more of the people who vote in primary elections are generally more ideological and closer to the fringes of the political spectrum to the center, getting primaried is a real problem. Because if the ideologues will vote for the more ideological candidate, and maybe you can win, but then that also makes you weaker for the subsequent general election, because then your opponent in the other party is going to be able to point to you making all these sort of relatively fringe promises that are further away from the center than you would have made otherwise, as evidence that you're more radical than you're putting on. So, it's problematic, basically, if you're an individual getting primary. That is something politicians worry about, and that's something that party leaderships use against party members. It's also something that activists use against party members. Frequently activists, lobbyists, what have you, will come to politicians and say, hey, you're not voting in a way that we like. If you don't start voting in a way that we like, we're going to run somebody, we're going to primary you. And that's so, in order to avoid that, politicians will generally hew a little more closer away from the center than they might vote otherwise in order to hedge against that possibility. But anyway, that's what it means to get primaried. So because party leaderships are stronger now in the United States, bills aren't debated as much. Now they're just sort of put up for a vote, and rank and file members just kind of have to vote for it, or otherwise, suffer the wrath of this, that, or the other leader or interest group or what have you. So what McCarthy had to promise to the Freedom Caucus is to try to include rank and file members more in the negotiation of bills. So in principle, that's not a bad thing. Really, bills should be debated more. Congress is nominally supposed to be a deliberative body. But of course, the issue is that demagogues and ideologues are going to abuse that in order to try to leverage basically condition their support on radical provisions that are never going to really be able to pass. So it's kind of a trade-off. You can have more inclusive processes for passing and negotiating bills, but the downside then is that that gives more of a window for malefactors to subvert the process, for their own benefit.
Mm-hmm.
In a less partisan era of American politics, that wouldn't have mattered as much because generally, uh, you know, the process was probably more corrupt, but the upshot of that is that stuff actually generally got done. Now it's not really about what you do, it's more about how you look. You want to be able to look like you're fighting for a given cause and that you're fighting for your preferred ideology. And the result is that people grandstand more than they used to. And that's been to the detriment of the actual political process of trying to get stuff done, to actually negotiate, debate, and pass bills.
Yeah, well, I think some of that has to do with how grandstanding, most of the time, I would guess the politician actually knows that they can't deliver all of those things, but people love hearing lots of promises strung together because that seems like someone who's willing to work hard to try to make change. So, sort of like you're using people's goodwill to your own short-term benefit, but then long-term, being able to deliver as a politician with actual change is a lot harder than to list off the changes that you know that they want. Because if you list them off, then people are like, oh yeah, this is my candidate, this is my person, like we're going to be able to do this kind of thing. Yeah, even a really good leader, I would say, is going to have to make compromises and meet in the middle, because passing anything is really hard, especially when you have a bunch of things that have something resembling a 50-50 split. You're going to have to be able to persuade some people in the middle.
Yeah, part of that too is just political theater.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to get reelected, then you need to have something to run on.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of point to your voting record, but that's not always very sexy. It's better if you can get in front of a camera and get recorded being dramatic,
Mm-hmm.
trying to make some kind of dramatic point that will resonate with your base,
Mm-hmm.
that has more value in a campaign. And so that's why politicians really want good committee assignments. There's a whole litany of different committees in Congress comprised of congressmen that are responsible for overseeing certain aspects of government or for designing bills that fall within very specific categories, telecommunications, the military, whatever. And the nice thing about being on a committee is that you can call people from industry or whatever to appear before you, and then you can kind of interrogate them or point your finger at them and accuse them of doing this, that, and the other. And there's not a lot of point to that generally, but it looks really good on camera. It makes it look like you're doing something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I knew a professor when I was in grad school who had actually appeared before a congressional committee once. They were basically asking about some kind of social program of some sort. And they'd requested that he had come and kind of speak before them and answer questions and whatnot. And, he was a public policy guy, so we figured, yeah, that's my bag. I'd be happy to do that. And he talked with them, the committee members, before he went before the committee. And, everybody was very polite. Everybody was very informed. Everybody kind of knew what they were talking about, etc. So his expectation is that it would be just like a normal Q&A. They would just ask technical questions and he would answer them to the best of his ability. So then he actually goes before the committee and it's nothing like that. Instead, they spend the whole session basically just skewering, this policy and criticizing it and, asking these really pointed, loaded questions about its efficacy and whatnot. And he was totally caught off guard. He wasn't expecting it at all. Like the way they were behaving beforehand was very professional, just sort of normal. And then during the committee hearing, they just turned into actors. It was just turned into a big circus, and he didn't really know how to handle it. So afterwards, he had a sort of very different perspective on congressional committees. So just always keep that in mind. Yeah, congressional committees do fulfill an important role, and in so much as getting key industry actors and whatnot or consultants before them and asking questions, that does have value as well. But just keep in mind that if you're seeing footage of them on the news, that's frequently almost scripted. Like they very much have in mind being on the news, and that's often one of the main impetuses for interviewing people before a committee. So political theater is just an inherent part of the process. It's just an inherent way that politicians generate political capital for their later re-election campaigns. Okay, so have you ever heard of the House Rules Committee?
Maybe. Remind me?
So the House Rules Committee is the committee in the House of Representatives that's responsible for basically writing up and enforcing all of the rule. Well, maybe not enforcing, but they write the rules that actually govern the day-to-day procedural minutia of the House's operations. So it's actually a really important committee, and generally it's only like really important senior members that are assigned to it. But on account of McCarthy not having enough support within the party, one of the concessions that he has supposedly given is that he's going to give a seat on the House Rules Committee to a member of the Freedom Caucus. So it's not going to give them a majority, but that is a very, very valuable seat. So probably they won't be able to swing, outcomes that much, but they will be able to make a lot of noise. Like I just said, committee assignments are very valuable because you can appear before a camera and look like you're doing something. So I don't doubt if a Freedom Caucus guy got on the House Rules Committee, he'll very much take advantage of that opportunity. Let's see. And then maybe some other seats on some premium committees. Some committees are more valuable than others. The ones that actually oversee industries that are worth billions of dollars. Obviously, those are more important and are more likely to garner media attention. If you're on the dog catcher committee or whatever, like nobody cares. So, a low-level committee is better than no committee, but it's not nearly as choice. And so generally it's younger guys who are less experienced who get those. So supposedly some of the more valuable committee seats are going to go to some more Freedom Caucus guys than there would have been otherwise. That's important because committee seats are an important sort of political commodity in the political economy, if you like, of politics in Washington. And so if McCarthy is giving those seats to Freedom Caucus guys, that probably means that he had to refrain from giving them to some of his core allies, because those seats normally would go to people who are your core supporters. So the fact that he has had to trade them away to some of the people who are not his core supporters actually weakens his position with his core of support. So that's just going to water down his whole position in the House even further. So again, all of these concessions basically are designed specifically to weaken McCarthy's leverage as House Speaker and make it harder for him to put pressure on other members to follow his lead. Most likely, it's going to be a very rough session for the House of Representatives in terms of actually getting stuff done, because there's going to be a lot of discontent and disgruntlement within the Republican Party, if not also the Democrats, who kind of have their own issues, but they haven't had nearly the problems thus far that the GOP has had with the Freedom Caucus. So there'll still be like investigations of the Biden administration and stuff. That's still going to happen. But beyond that, I wouldn't have really high expectations for major legislative progress in terms of key issues. Just a couple other items. Supposedly, he's promised to be more fiscally conservative. So one of the knocks against the Republican Party since 2016 is that they kind of threw fiscal conservatism right out the window. They had the Donald Trump's big tax cut, but which was not really matched with any kind of significant budget cuts. There was a lot more spending sent towards the military, and then there was all the COVID spending. So there's been a big jump in government spending over the past several years, and fiscal conservatives are not really happy about it. And the Freedom Caucus, in particular, which fancies itself particularly fiscally conservative, has conditioned their support for McCarthy on him being more restrained on government spending. We'll see if it actually happens, but nominally, McCarthy has promised to do that. So the reason that could be drama is that there's probably going to be another push to significantly cut spending when the budget for next year is negotiated at the end of this year, and that could result in a government shutdown. So more government shutdown drama could be pending later this year. And McCarthy, given the lack of leverage that he has over the Freedom Caucus, may not have sufficient political capital to get their support, which means he's either going to have to do some kind of bipartisan deal, which is dangerous because, again, he could easily be primaried, or he's going to have to kind of go along with the Freedom Caucus, in which case there could be a prolonged standoff. Let's see. So some other things, they've asked for more emphasis on immigration, and they've also asked for term limits on House reps. So neither of those are really big concessions on the part of McCarthy. I suspect those requests were made more for political reasons than any substantive effort to get an actual concession. So, for example, immigration is already a core part of the GOP's platform, so that was already getting a lot of attention. And then term limits for House reps would require a constitutional amendment, which isn't going to happen. So that's just fanciful on their part. So they did that more for the cameras than I suspect they did for McCarthy. So yeah, that's what's been going on in the House of Representatives. A little bit of wheeling and dealing to start the year.
It's interesting how they use, like, it's almost like making a stink around your parents to get what you want when they say no to you. The various tactics like filibustering or threatening to primary somebody. I don't know. I know the aspects are important for accountability. Like if you want people to do what the party wants, kind of a thing, that makes sense. But on a personal level, it still seems kind of weird. Political theater is pretty silly.
It is at that. It is at that. Well, let me get the usual disclaimer out of the way before I forget. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. My background is more economics, foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. I do learn a lot from chat when we do this. It's one of the fun aspects of the experience for me. So participation in chat is encouraged in that regard. Get that out early.
Yep.
Oh, did you want the dumb stories now, or did you want to end on them?
Let's do some dumb stories now. I'm keen.
Yeah, just every so often, they kind of pop up. They tend to pop up in clusters. So the theme today is urination. You've heard of Wells Fargo, right?
Yes. I'm like, what? The setup is urination, then we have a bank. Okay, what happened with Wells Fargo?
So Wells Fargo has a branch in India, and one of the executives in their India branch apparently got drunk on a flight and urinated on a woman on the plane with him. And the lady was obviously less than pleased with that, and so she filed a complaint with the airline, and later on, the airline actually pressed charges against him. And as a result, Wells Fargo not only was he fired by Wells Fargo, but the police are after him. And apparently he's on the run. Apparently they haven't actually caught him yet. So
Wow.
an odd sequence of events there.
Wow. What a
You'd
mess.
think people would know better than to get drunk on flights by now, but I guess not. So the other one here involves the president of South Sudan. So he was apparently at an official function, and during the function, he apparently wet his pants, which was recorded by some local journalists. Oops. And when the president found out that he had been recorded, he had them arrested. And as a result, there's been a not insubstantial kerfuffle between the South Sudanese government and international journalist associations, which are demanding that the journalists be released unconditionally.
Deleted from the internet. It's embarrassing me.
Yeah, the journalists in question point out that they never actually aired the footage, but apparently that doesn't matter to them. So they're still in jail as of now. So, like I said, just a pair of dumb stories. There's no real point to it, just weird shit.
Yeah. Humans do be like that sometimes.
But it were otherwise.
Yeah, chat's pointing out altitude difference. I think it has more to do with the oxygenation of the air than the actual altitude, but I might be wrong about that. But I've definitely gotten more... I don't know if it was more drunk than I expected, but I definitely got more hungover than I expected when I visited South Dakota one of the times. I did have a decent bit of drinks, for sure, so it wasn't like I got totally blindsided. It was just more so if I drank that amount at sea level, it would have been fine. But there is quite a bit less oxygen the further up you get. I think planes, like, they pump in a certain amount of oxygen, so it's pretty similar to ground level, but maybe someone knows better than me on that front. I'm not sure about it.
I would defer to chat on that. It's been a long time since I took any kind of class involving hard science. I'm woefully out of date. Well, I did draw up something of an agenda for 2023. Well, not an agenda per se, but just a rough outline of some of the stuff that we have to look forward to. So we might breeze through some of that if you don't have anything else that you kind of wanted to get to.
Sure, the only thing I saw in chat mentioned was people wanted a Ukraine update.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we can do that. Let me open the file. Let's see what's going on. When was the last time we were on?
It was before Christmas.
Before Christmas. Okay, so it's been a couple weeks. Okay. So let's see, right here. There's been more chatter about Belarus maybe jumping into the war, but I don't think that's very likely. Everything I've read from analysts suggests that it's not likely. Belarusian government just has no incentive to get involved with the war, at least not any more than they already are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Belarusian army is not that strong or big, so they would probably get chewed up pretty quick. Mm-hmm. And that would be a big problem for the president of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko, because the army is a big part of his extended patronage network, by which he maintains his hold on power. So, you know, sending the people you depend on to maintain your hold on power into a war in which they're probably going to get mangled is probably not going to inspire a lot of confidence from those people.
Damn, there goes my patronage network. Send in the other patronage network.
So most likely, Lukashenko is going to find every excuse he can to avoid sending his army into Ukraine. Let's see. Oh, also worth noting, before the previous Congress in the United States recessed for the holidays, they did pass a big new bill. Well, it was the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's the bill they pass every year to fund the military. So that's always, of course, a big bill. The United States spends a lot of money on the military. So in the NDAA for 2023, Congress actually wrote in about $45 billion of aid, which was an unusually large amount. You know, they had been passing bills in order to secure aid for Ukraine off and on several times since the war started over the course of 2022. But this amount is much larger than in any of those previous examples. And the reason, well, I can't say for sure, but from what I read, the reason they did that was most likely because there was some skepticism that the new GOP-controlled House would be as interested in sending aid to Ukraine as the previous Congress. So the result then is that they tried to secure a large lump sum as a hedge, just in case there's a little more reticence on the part of the new Congress to send money to Ukraine. Ukraine will still have a nice fat check there, $45 billion worth, in order to kind of help them out.
Man, that would
Oh,
be
and
nice.
President Zelensky visited Washington. Did you see that?
I did not.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was big news when it happened. It was pretty sudden. I remember reading that the headline was basically that Zelensky was traveling outside of Ukraine. And, they didn't know exactly where he was going, but there was a lot of speculation that he was headed to Washington. And, sure enough, next day, he popped up in Washington and he actually gave a speech in front of Congress. It was actually, I forget the technical term, but basically it's when both houses of Congress are in the same room. It was like I think a joint session of Congress is what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
So both the Senate and the House of Representatives were together, and they both listened to Zelensky give a speech. And it was pretty much what you'd expect. He was very grateful for all of the support that had been given. He asked for more support, and he made the case that it was in America's interest to help Ukraine. I think the big item that was sort of the main takeaway was that money, specifically aid, that the United States was giving Ukraine was not charity, but was rather an investment in international security.
Mm-hmm.
So that was sort of the quote that really made the rounds in the news and online after the fact. Other than that, it was not really that remarkable a speech. He hit the highlights, and there was lots of rounds of applause and whatnot and cheering. Everybody is quite fond of him, or at least the majority of senators and reps in the United States are pretty fond of him, or perhaps just pretend to be, regardless.
Well, for people who didn't follow the earlier episodes where we focused on the war in Ukraine, he used to be an actor.
Yeah.
And he played as the person who was the president or prime minister or whatever of Ukraine. So he's definitely got showmanship and quite a lot of charisma. So compared to a lot of more dry politicians, yeah, he's definitely going to be a standout. But then he's totally stepped up to the plate to really make his people feel encouraged and represent a real and actual leader, which is pretty badass.
Yeah, he's definitely used his force of personality to great effect.
Mm-hmm.
But the speech was basically designed to try to mollify the GOP in particular, which was seen as kind of more the source of relatively more skepticism of aid to Ukraine. So managing skepticism in the United States is definitely a major objective, not only of the Ukrainian government, but also Ukraine supporters in U.S. politics. So, recognizing that relatively more skeptics of supporting Ukraine are entering the new Congress. We're going to enter the new Congress in 2023. There was a sense that Zelensky needed to kind of make an effort to reach out to those people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he was making the point that, the aid is not charity, it's an investment, it benefits you as well. We're all on the same team, we're all fighting for the same values. He also drew parallels between the war and American battles like the Battle of the Bulge and the Battle of Saratoga. So, all of that is kind of meant to sort of tickle conservatives in particular. It's meant to really appeal to them and their perspective. So it was very much an engineered speech. It was very clearly targeted in that sense. I don't know how successful it was, but I do think that the effort itself was probably more important than the content.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually listened to the speech on the radio here because I'm old. And the speech itself was kind of hard to follow at times. His English is not fluent, so it was a little difficult to kind of pick out every word.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a little tricky in that sense. And the speech was not exactly, grandiose. It didn't have big sweeping analogies or historical appeals or anything like that. It was a very practical and to the point speech for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
He had some core points that he wanted to make, and he really kind of focused on those. And that was pretty much it. So it was kind of over and done with. overall. And it's probably not going to go down as one of the great speeches in Congress, but it is an important one in so much as it serves to kind of solidify the relationship between the United States and Ukraine and try to make the case before the American public and American politicians that that relationship is worth maintaining. Let's see. That's not really an update, but so I did read an article that made the case that the Russians are doing better at adapting. You know, one of the big criticisms of the Russian army, I guess in the first year roughly of the war, has been that they really have not been very flexible in responding to new circumstances on the ground. I mean, it was bad enough to just kind of roll into Ukraine expecting no resistance. But it was just as bad, if not worse, that they failed to adapt their strategy thereafter. Like for a very long time, they were basically just doing the same thing, you know, just rolling troops in and hoping that resistance would melt away. And the fact that it took them several weeks to really change tack does not speak well of their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. So that was kind of a pattern through most of 2022, but in the latter months of 2022, they did show relatively more flexibility. So there has been some improvement in that regard. So some specific examples. For one, they actually assigned a single general to be in charge of the whole war effort. You know, you'd think they would have done that at the start, but they actually did not. They actually had different generals responsible for different parts of the front, and they did not communicate with each other, near as we can tell. There was minimal coordination on that count, and that was one of the reasons that the invasion was relatively disjointed. You know, one part of the offensive was not really working in conjunction with another part. They were basically just independent mini wars happening within the same war. So that's going to help with their command and control, that they just have the one guy kind of overseeing the whole operation. They're also using ranged fires more. Obviously, Ukrainians already know this. Russia's been going out of its way to really go after Ukraine's electricity network. So that's so that's kind of met with mixed success. But earlier in the war, they weren't really doing that so much. They were not using cruise missiles and aircraft and whatnot very effectively. So going after the power network is not like a great strategy, but it's more coherent than what they've been doing earlier. So at least they have some kind of plan. So in that sense, they're being more purposeful in how they use their cruise missiles and whatnot. They're fine. Well, I guess this isn't an example of adaptation, but the reservists that they mobilized as part of the mobilization are kind of starting to hit the front in critical mass. They're probably not going to fully deploy all of the people they mobilized until early this year, probably within the next couple months. Like, it was mobilizing that number of people, several 100,000, given the lack of resources and administrative capacity in Russia, was always going to be a heavy lift. And so, you know, even in February 2022, I was reading that even if Russia mobilized, it would just take like months and months. And that's pretty much been borne out. But that time has passed, and so those people are now actually getting to the front line. So Ukraine also has been mobilizing people, so this doesn't necessarily translate to a major quantitative advantage, although Russia does still have that. But the fact that they are able to kind of throw people into the meat grinder, that does help the Russians. That is one of the advantages that they have and that they will continue to have as they continue to mobilize people. The dog agrees with me. Let's see. They've also been getting better at retreating to more defensive positions, and they've been better about fortifying those positions. You know, before they've just been taking a kind of not one step back approach to defending territory they'd taken. It's kind of a reference to the Eastern Front in World War II. That was one of Stalin's dictates, not one step back. So they've kind of been doing that, and obviously that was just dumb. You know, if you're going to defend a position, you should try to make sure that position is innately defendable. And if it's not, then you should retreat to some other position that is innately defensible. And the new generals that have kind of taken charge since the war started have been better about doing that. They've been better at trying to defend along rivers and other terrain that is more conducive to the defense.
Yeah, the gaming analogy that's coming up is like, I get the idea. It's a very romantic one that you're just so brave that you never retreat. But sometimes the landscape is so bad that for you to take a fight there is just criminally dumb. There's a funny line from the movie Inglourious Bastards. He says, "You don't have to be Stonewall Jackson to you don't want to fight in a fucking basement." So there are just some places that while you could take it and you could hold it, it would be so inefficient and such a poor use of your forces to hold it that it's much better to just fall back to a more defensible location that has some ground that's easier to control.
So they've been better about doing that. So they also had a fairly organized retreat from Kherson or Harrison. Uh, you know, the retreat from Kharkiv, sort of in the fall when they were pushed out during that one Ukrainian offensive. That was pretty helter-skelter. That was not a well-organized retreat. Retreating is actually a pretty difficult thing to do in warfare. It's very easy for a retreat to turn into a rout. So it requires a good deal of professionalism on the part of your officers and leadership to make that work. And the retreat from the Northeast was not. But the retreat from Kherson was much more organized and much more methodical. So that does speak to the capability of the Russian army to do that, given the right circumstances and the right leadership. And then I've also read that they've been getting better at confusing Ukrainian air defenses. Apparently, they weren't really trying very hard. Before, they were just lobbing missiles and aircraft into Ukrainian airspace and hoping for the best. But they've actually been trying harder to use electronic warfare and other tactics like using dummies and whatnot to try to misdirect Ukrainian air defenses. So there is, all told, adaptation happening. It's happening very slowly, but it is happening. So the Russians are kind of getting better here as the war goes along. Let's see. Oh yeah. So the United States announced, I think in December, that the United States government was going to give Ukraine Patriot missile systems. Did you hear about that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, that's a system that we used to use. It's like maybe not our newest, but it's...
We still use them, I think. If I'm not mistaken. That's, well...
Have we used them since the 90s?
Yeah, I think we've used them since the 90s.
Yeah.
In so much as using means deploying. I don't know how often they've been used to actually shoot anything down.
Mm-hmm.
And we've definitely still been exporting them. But I think we are in the process of phasing them out. I think we've got something called THAADs, which is kind of fulfilling that role now. Mm-hmm. But I think we still do have them in inventory. And nominally they are still deployed, I believe. Somebody in chat almost invariably knows more than I do about it, so I'll defer to them. But yeah, that was a big ask on the part of Ukraine. One of the things that happened over the course of November and December is that the Russians really went hard in terms of attacking the electrical network, the power network in Ukraine. And that actually changed some minds in Western governments in Europe and the United States. And so they became much more willing to provide Ukraine with surface-to-air missile systems and other air defense vehicles and equipment. So the Patriot missile system was one such change in that regard. Before the Biden administration was pretty reluctant to give them up. Well, not give them up per se, but it was seen as a potential escalation. And of course, Western governments have been very wary about escalation with Russia. But after the power network attacks, they decided that it was okay. It was worth the risk. And so Ukraine has been green-lighted as far as Patriot missile systems and as well as other air defense systems that have been provided by other countries. I think Germany is going to give them one of their air defense vehicles. I forget what it's called. I'm not too familiar with German military vehicles. I haven't fought enough wars over the past couple of decades. I haven't had the opportunity to read up on them. Let's see. Yeah, we already kind of talked about that last time. Well, more recently, I'm kind of skipping ahead of the notes a little bit here, but more recently, the Biden administration announced, I think in the past week, that they're going to start sending Bradley fighting vehicles. Are you familiar with those?
No. What are those?
So the M2 Bradley it's actually a lot of things. I think nominally it's an infantry fighting vehicle or something. It was originally designed to be a kind of, to be a transport. It was meant to transport infantry on the battlefield. But in the design process, they added a bunch of other stuff to it, and it ended up kind of being a multi-role vehicle. It was supposed to be able to do troop transport, but also reconnaissance, and then also be able to defeat armored vehicles. And it was kind of a mess. There was actually a movie made about the development of the Bradley called Pentagon Wars, which was explicitly about all of the bullshit that happened during the development of the Bradley. And it was a development process that lasted like 20 years or something. It was just ridiculous. But anyway, infantry fighting vehicle, let's put it like that. It's an armored vehicle that can transport troops, and it also has I want to say 25 millimeter autocannon, which is pretty decent. It'll certainly ruin an infantryman's day if he gets hit by it. But it can also penetrate a decent amount of armor. So if it's up against something like a BMP or something, it can probably shoot that. Not shoot it down per se, but you could probably defeat that with the autocannon. If I'm not mistaken, they're also equipped with some missile launchers, which are generally TOW missiles, if I'm not mistaken. TOW missiles are anti-tank missiles. TOW stands for Tube-Launched Optically Sighted Wire-Guided Missile. It's kind of an older model of anti-tank missile that you actually fly into its target. So it's not guided in the sense that it locks onto a target. Rather, somebody in the tank actually fires it and then flies the missile into a given target. And there's literally a wire that connects the missile to the launch vehicle that is used to send commands from the the person guiding the missile to the missile itself. And they literally just fly it with a joystick, I think. It's a little tricky to use because, depth perception is a problem. If the target is far away or if it's at an angle or something, it can be a little tricky. Or if the target is moving, that can be difficult. But it is effective at blowing up armored vehicles. So if you can hit something with it, it'll definitely do damage. So the M2 Bradley has that stuff. I don't know if that's necessarily all going to be involved in the types of Bradleys that they'll be sending. They may be sending older models or maybe export models or something. But they are going to get them, and they should help out. They should give Ukrainian infantrymen more survivability and also more mobility, both of which are pretty important on the battlefield over there. I think France also announced that they're going to send some of their light armored vehicles. I'm not even sure what to call them. There was a whole debate on Twitter about whether or not they were tanks. They're wheeled vehicles, and they have 6 wheels, but they do have a tank turret, right? They have a big gun. Mm-hmm. So it's like a tank, but it's much lighter than most tanks. Yeah, the French have kind of specialized in light tanks. I think over the Cold War, that was kind of their niche. But they're going to send those. And then Germany is going to send something called the Martyr, which I think translates as Marauder. And I honestly don't know shit about it. Again, German vehicles are not my specialty. So Ukraine is going to get a nice little Christmas basket of stuff there. Patriot missiles, other air defense systems, Bradleys, Marauders, and AMX 10s, or whatever they were. Yeah, that's just part of a general trend that's going to kind of emerge over 2023 in which Ukraine gets more and more stuff. I don't know necessarily how much risk, in so much as there is any, that the United States and other Western governments are willing to take on as far as sending more advanced tech and more equipment and whatnot. But the trend seems to be more and more risk tolerant. From what I was reading, there's more and more of a sense in the West, specifically in Western governments, that Russia is not really willing to escalate in response to significant material aid to Ukraine. So you'll probably, in so much as that's true, you're probably going to see more of that aid manifest progressively so over the course of 2023. And there's also a lot of there's a lot of new manufacturing capacity that the United States in particular is investing in so that it can produce things like more artillery shells, missiles, what have you. Ammunition is, a big part of the war, and both Russia and Ukraine have been experiencing shortages. So the sooner that the United States can increase manufacturing capacity and fill that gap, the better off Ukraine will be. It'll be a big edge if they can actually get enough ammo to meet their needs. So some of that, some of the investment in greater capacity started in 2022, but it was always going to take a long time, to really get it rolling. Some of that was just hiring more people to work in existing factories so that, that capacity could be tapped very quickly. But really, if they want to produce everything that Ukraine needs, they're going to have to build whole new factories. And they actually are doing that. But that's probably not really going to hit scale until 2024. Production will significantly increase by summer 23, so within the next 6 months. So, Ukraine will get more stuff, not just vehicles, but actual ammunition over the course of the next 6 months. But, the United States is not really going to hit its stride in terms of supplying ammo until next year, roughly, from what I've read anyway. And one of the interesting things I read about that in the article on manufacturing capacity and the U.S. investment in it is that the United States was more willing to invest in greater manufacturing capacity, not just to replace lost inventory, but because they're more confident the war is actually going to last a long time, which I thought was pretty notable. So, if anybody's holding out for the war to end in 2023, Washington seems to disagree with you. It seems the expectation is that it's going to last into 2024, if not longer. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's inevitably going to last into 2024. Regardless of how long you think the war lasts, investing in capacity like this sends the signal that you're prepared for it to last into 2024 and beyond. So that sends a signal to Russia that our support to Ukraine is not short term. We're in it for the long haul. So for as long as they want to keep fighting in Ukraine, the United States is going to keep supplying Ukraine. So it's a good signal to send regardless of how long you think the war is going to last. That sends a good signal to Russia that maybe will deter them from hoping that the United States is just going to get tired and quit, basically. Investing all this money into capacity suggests that, no, we're in it for the long haul. Let's see, more Wagner Group people in Ukraine. Wagner Group is getting pretty big. Wagner Group is sort of a quasi-mercenary group, which is owned by a guy named Prigozhin. He's sort of a oligarch slash Putin crony. And, like a lot of political elites in Russia right now, he's kind of taking advantage of the war in Ukraine to try to jockey for position within Putin's patronage network. And he's doing that by trying to make the Wagner Group out into a military asset that the Russian military is kind of dependent on. So one of the things he did in the latter part of 2022 is he raised a bunch of troops, partly through prisons in Russia. He actually went out and recruited a bunch of convicts to join the Wagner Group. And then he also went overseas and tried to get mercenaries from other countries to sign up. So he kind of filled up Wagner Group's ranks in that way. And then he tried to make Wagner Group the lead force in the Battle of Bakhmut, which is the city in Donbass that the Russian army has been trying very hard to take for much of the past 4 or 5 months or so. And Wagner Group has not made a great account of itself in doing so. They've kind of blown through a good chunk of their membership since then, but Prigozhin is still finding more people, or is trying to find more, and the result is that high attrition has not deterred him from really pushing the offensive there. Yeah, it's interesting to see the Russian army's composition in Ukraine. It's not just Russian army regulars anymore. I mean, it never really was, but it's increasingly turning into kind of an eclectic agglomeration of different groups. You've got the Russian army regulars, but then you've got the Chechen militiamen, and then you've got the separatist republics with their own little militias, like the Donetsk militia and the Lugansk militia. And then you've got the contractors like the Wagner Group and probably other groups as well. I think there was another oligarch that tried to raise a militia and send it to Ukraine recently just to try to counter Prigozhin's influence. So, the desire and need for manpower is real. And the result is that the Russian army, it's kind of fracturing a little bit. Not a whole lot. It's not like melting down or anything, but because they're taking on so many of these weird, extra governmental forces and trying to incorporate them into their order of battle, it's resulted in kind of a weird motley agglomeration of people. And so that could create problems down the line because one of the themes in Russian military history is that powerful figures in Russian politics and in government, including generals, presidents, what have you, they frequently clash with each other because they frequently, some of them are glory hounds. They want to try to monopolize victories for themselves, or maybe they try to sabotage rivals. That was one of the reasons Russia lost the Battle of Tannenberg back in World War One. So, as the Russian army becomes, as the portion of the military in Ukraine comprised by the Russian army falls over time, that could make it more likely that those kinds of clashes happen again. And so that could complicate and deteriorate command and control for the Russian army in Ukraine. But it could also be that the Russian army is able to mobilize larger and larger numbers of, mobics, mobilized personnel, and is able to kind of reclaim its paramount position. Maybe the militias and Wagner Group are more of a stopgap until they can mobilize more people. So that could also be the case. But for now, it's just a weird order of battle. Osprey Books is going to have a field day. Have you heard of them?
Osprey Field Books?
Osprey Books. Osprey is a company that writes military history books, and they're not really heavy on history. They're actually more illustrated, and they focus on illustrating things like uniforms and weapons and stuff like that. It's kind of a useful guide if you're interested in sort of the visual aspect of military history.
Huh.
So generally, the more factions and stuff and other groups that a war has, the more stuff that Osprey has to put into a book. They've got all these different types of soldiers who are going to be wearing different paraphernalia, different medals, different insignia and stuff. And so that's all the kind of things that's the kind of stuff they specialize in.
Mm.
So I'm sure there'll be a whole long Osprey book about the war in Ukraine with a whole section, maybe even a whole book. If there's a lot of different groups, they'll have just whole books about one particular faction in the war. That's what they did with the Russian Civil War. They had one book for the whites and then one for the reds.
Hmm.
Yeah, lots of different factions in the Russian Civil War.
Yeah, chat's pointing out regarding the many different types of forces being employed in the Russian military, the Chechenian troops, and how those are kind of thrown into the fray, but they have, I think, different leadership than this one general guy for the Russian operation.
Oh yeah, all the different factions have different leadership. Like the Russian army has the one lead general now. I think his name is Surovkin or something. But Wagner Group is led by Prigozhin. The Chechens are led by Imran Kadyrov, I think his name is, who's the sort of governor slash dictator of Chechnya.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of got a whole parallel government type deal going on there. And then the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics kind of have their own leadership, which is probably heavily influenced by either the FSB or the SVR. I can never tell anymore which of them is responsible for foreign intelligence operations. Nominally the SVR is supposed to be responsible for foreign operations, and then the FSB is supposed to be responsible for domestic operations. But in practice, they both do foreign stuff. So one or the other, if not both, are probably involved with the separatist republics. Yeah, one of the weird trends I've seen since the war started is that the Russian political system is kind of becoming almost feudal. It's almost becoming a system of lords and sort of serving the king, rather than a more modern system where you have institutions that are responsible for governance. As of now, it's really based more on personality and your individual fiefdoms within the Russian political system. And that could worsen over time, depending on Putin and, his hold on power. I think so long as he's alive, he'll be able to kind of maintain control and stability within the political system. But if something happens to him, there could be problems because there's a lot of ambitious assholes in that patronage network. And I don't think they're going to play nice with each other if it comes down to, well, if there has to be a succession, right? In monarchies, succession is frequently a very fraught process. And if the king did not have a son, a clear heir, then frequently wars would erupt. So there could be something similar here. If Putin does not have any kind of designated heir of one kind or another, then when he dies, there could be a scramble for power with what will probably be pretty deleterious impacts on the stability of Russia.
Has he said anything about that?
Oh, no. He's going to live forever, didn't you know?
Oh, well, that's convenient.
Oh, always. I mean, one of the troubles with authoritarian political systems is that once you're on the top of the system, you can't ever really stop being on top. Because it's very easy for somebody who gets on top instead of you to just eliminate your whole patronage network and supplant you completely. And of course, in an authoritarian political system, it's winner take all, right? So, if you're leaving, you're not going to leave a previous leader alone, because that guy is always going to be a threat because he's got his own patronage network. So it's much better to marginalize that person as much as possible. That's kind of what's happening to Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. We talked about the big protests there way back early 2022. So, if you're a dictator of some kind, once you're in power, it's extremely difficult for you to kind of navigate your way out of power in a way that you would be confident of your safety. That's just extremely difficult. So Putin is not going to leave. He's going to stay there, whether he wants to or not. He's kind of compelled to, because if he gives up power to the point where somebody's more powerful than him, or maybe even just equal in power, he leaves himself vulnerable to some kind of power play that could just totally eject him from the political system, or maybe even result in him being imprisoned or killed.
Yeah, well, when you have a really aggressive form of leadership, then you're going to make a lot of enemies, and as soon as you can't defend yourself against those enemies, they're going to run at you. So, yeah.
There's that, but there's also just uncertainty. Like with any authoritarian political system, the political system is opaque, but it's not just opaque to the people outside the system, it's actually also opaque to the people in the political system. Right? If you have rule of law, then you know what positions people serve in and what responsibilities and powers they have, and you have a whole system of transferring power, elections and whatnot, by which you can infer who's relatively more powerful and whatnot, and by which people can compete in politics in a healthy way. There's no such order regarding politics in an authoritarian political system, right? It's all about personality, it's all about who you know, it's all about who's in your network. But that's never really obvious to everybody. Like who's in whose network is not like published on a website or in a book somewhere. You'll have a rough idea of whether somebody is affiliated with somebody else, whether somebody's in somebody else's patronage network. But that could change, right? They're free agents. There's no orderly way by which people manage which patronage network they're in. It's just whoever you think will give you the most value. But because it's not done legally, you can easily change affiliation anytime you want. There could be dire consequences depending on who you're screwing over, but it can happen. And, people will shift with the winds. Like if somebody thinks that the patronage network they're in is not really paying off or is getting weaker, they could jump ship. And they may, sell out their previous patron in order to get a better deal with somebody else. So, the defining characteristic of authoritarian political systems, at least for the people who lead them, is not power or absolute power. It's actually uncertainty. And managing that uncertainty is the main object of politics among elites in authoritarian political systems. You want to make sure that the people who serve under you in your patronage network, are loyal. So as a result, the type of personality that is very common in authoritarian political systems is a personality that is not questioning of authority, that is very deferential, that does not take risks, that is basically just sycophantic. It's not the kind of person that takes the initiative or takes risks or comes up with bold plans. It's basically just people who do what they're told and not much else. In so much as there's competition, it's generally between people at the lower levels of the patronage network. But beyond that, competition between people at the top of different networks, that can get very bloody, depending on how ambitious they are. And because there's so much uncertainty too, it frequently does get violent, because that's really the main tool by which you can coerce people. Because, you can't really go to the legal system, because, then your opponents can just bribe a judge or whatever, or call in a favor from a friend, or just something like that. Like, there's just no systemic means of managing that kind of competition. So it just kind of all happens in shadows. It's really much more akin to a mafia than it is to a government in that sense. And so that's the kind of political system that Russia has. And so when Putin, when I talk about Putin hedging his bets, the fact that he just can't step down because, that would leave him at risk, it's more about the uncertainty in that sense than it is necessarily about having specific enemies that he knows would come after him. He's actually probably more concerned with his friends, the people who are nominally loyal to him, potentially betraying him in the event that he steps down. That's actually a much bigger threat. And he has no way of knowing who would do that. Because again, it's all just uncertainty. So that's why he's going to stay in power, probably for the long haul. But that also means that when he eventually does die, then there's going to be some kind of scramble, and that's going to again, be very destabilizing. Let's see, I talked about that already. So I guess this is just trivia right here. This is kind of a fun fact. So donation efforts, quote unquote, basically the United States has donated a number of Javelin missiles to Ukraine that is equivalent to about 5 years of production.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
So, yeah, it's a lot. We've pretty well hollowed out a good chunk of the inventory there. But that doesn't necessarily speak to the scale of aid given to Ukraine so much as it speaks to the lack of manufacturing capacity. Really, we should be able to produce a lot more, much more quickly. But, again, it was not expected that a modern war would necessarily require continued production of new munitions. It was expected that existing inventories would be sufficient for some kind of short, limited war, which had very much been the norm for the US military over the past couple decades. So the result is that manufacturing capacity was significantly hollowed out over the past couple decades, and now we're having to really play catch up in order to try to ensure we have sufficient capacity to meet the needs of what is apparently the very ammo-hungry nature of modern war. Let's see. Supposedly, Russia has expended 80% of its missile inventory. Again, that's kind of a guesstimate. I don't know that anybody really knows that for sure outside of Russia, but given records of what inventories Russia had before the war and given how many they've used thus far, that's probably not too far off the mark from what I was reading. So they'll be able to make up some of that with manufacturing in Russia, but that's going to get harder over time as the West starts cracking down more and more on exports of electronics. Well, not electronics, but microchips, which are one of the key inputs there for those missiles. Oh, and one of the recent items, so there was a Ukrainian missile strike on a barracks in Donbass, I think last week. And they killed apparently several hundred Russian troops specifically. That was the Ukrainian claim. The Ukrainian claim, uh, something like a couple hundred, I think. And then the Russians said it was only a couple dozen. So, believe who you want to believe. Depends on who you prefer to listen to. But it was probably closer to 200 or so. Because there are bloggers in Russia that specialize in, military news. They're called mill bloggers, and they came out and started shitting on the government almost immediately because they apparently were on site and could confirm that the casualties were very heavy. And they were also reporting that ammunition had apparently been stored either in or near the barracks, and that was part of the reason the explosion was more damaging. That so many people had been killed. So they were pretty upset about that. They were kind of bitching out the Russian army for concentrating so many people in one place and for storing flammable ammunition and whatnot in the vicinity. So there's been not inconsiderable consternation on the Russian internet amongst Russian nationalists on that count. Let's see, what else did we have here? Notes kind of got backed up over the past couple weeks.
It happens.
Oh, here we go. So I mentioned before that there was another political elite in Russia's political system who had raised his own private army and was trying to send it to Ukraine as a counter, to kind of counter the influence of Prigozhin's Wagner group. So that was actually the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. And he's apparently raised a mercenary group called Patriot to fight in Donbass. So it's not entirely clear what they're going to do, apparently, but the fact that he felt it necessary to do that kind of speaks to the degree of elite competition happening in Russia right now, and how some of that competition is manifesting as these little private armies. Let's see. So the 2023 NDAA passed in the US apparently also had a provision asking for the Treasury Department to kind of crack down on sanctions. So you could see more sanctions action in 2023. Yeah, there was a good deal in 2022, but it was front loaded. Most of the most thorough and impactful sanctions were actually implemented right at the start of the war. But after that, there wasn't nearly as much follow up. Some of that was just because the US government did not want to put more pressure on Europe. Obviously, the logical target of sanctions would be Russian oil and natural gas, but Europe was not ready, to completely cut off imports. So the result is that the United States and Europe have kind of been taking it easy on Russia in terms of sanctions, at least after the initial, cut off from the SWIFT banking system and, other targeted sanctions going after Russian banks. They have not gone nearly as hard as they could have. For example, Iran actually has a lot more sanctions applied against them that are more impactful. So now that Europe has had time to kind of adjust and try to find new sources of oil and natural gas and other resources that they had been getting from Russia, you'll start to see more sanctions probably in 2023 in the headlines. That's my expectation anyway. Okay. It was AMX-10 RC. That was the French armored vehicle that they're going to start sending to Ukraine. AMX-10 RC, Bradleys, and then the Marder. And then Germany also announced that they're going to send a Patriot anti-missile system, or anti-aircraft, surface-to-air missile system. There we go. I think it's only one battery, but every little bit helps. So let's see, that's just kind of a grab bag of different stuff from Ukraine. That's all I had for today, but yeah, no particular coherence. Basically just highlights that I had in my notes.
Nice, appreciate that. We do have some questions being passed along by Fuzzy Cord. Appreciate you, Fuzzy Cord.
Oh, thank you, Fuzzy. Let me see. That's Neuro. And then I think it's up at the top. Did you get lots of fireworks up there?
I was in South Dakota for New Year's Eve.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, population density much lower there.
Okay, here we go. Questions. In 5 years, will Crimea be in Russia or Ukraine? Well, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Nobody really knows how that's going to pan out. I mean, the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian media has been making noise about a possible offensive into Crimea, in which the territory could be liberated. But yeah, I'm pretty skeptical. That's going to be a heavy lift. Crimea is very defendable as far as territories go. It's a peninsula for one, and the Russian Navy, however, limited its operations may have been by Ukrainian operations, is still probably going to be able to deflect any attempt at an amphibious landing. And even an attempt by the Ukrainian army to move across the isthmus that connects the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine is going to be really difficult because that isthmus is actually very, very narrow. And to the point where it's just really, really easy to defend against anybody trying to attack across it. Now, that hasn't stopped people historically. I would note that historically speaking, attempts to invade Crimea have actually been weirdly successful. The British and the French during the Crimean War, and then during the Russian Civil War. This is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but during the Russian Civil War, one of the last bastions, in fact, I think the last bastion of the whites, who were the anti-communists fighting against the Bolsheviks in the war, was Crimea. They were systematically beaten back by the Bolsheviks until they basically retreated into Crimea and were planning on trying to make it a fortress. They were going to try to make that the final redoubt of non-communist white Russia. And so they had all these plans drawn up to try to defend along the isthmus and to just kind of hold that as a defensive line. And for a while, they actually managed to launch an offensive into Ukraine, which was eventually beaten back. But then, it was expected that they would probably be able to hold the line at the northern Crimea, along that isthmus. And they failed miserably, partly because of fog, basically fog and low tide, I think it was. So there was a stretch of territory that became passable because it dried out. And so the Bolsheviks took advantage of fog and that circuitous route to flank the White Army's defenses. And the result is that the front line that the White Army had set up and fortified ended up getting flanked from the side and from the rear. And the Bolsheviks were able to roll up their defenses promptly after that. And they didn't have nearly enough people for a defense in depth. So once that front line got rolled up, they just didn't have anything left. That was it for them. And Crimea fell in pretty short order after that. So Crimea is very defendable, but historically there is some, precedent for those defenses being defeated, via creative leadership. But in general, I would have to presume that the Russians would be able to defend it pretty handily. And the Ukrainian army still doesn't have great offensive capabilities right now. They're much better at bleeding frontline Russian units and then taking advantage of opportunistic weakness at different parts of the front. Western intelligence has been very helpful in that regard. But as we saw in Kherson, they can't really push out, per se, at least as of yet, a determined defense by the Russian army. The Kherson retreat by the Russians was as much about retreating behind a defensive line, that being the Dnieper River, as it was about Ukrainian army pressure. So I think it'll take a while for the Ukrainian army to build up the capability to launch real, true offensive operations that can really challenge the Russian army on an even footing. They're going to need more modern vehicles, they're going to need more people trained in using the modern vehicles, and they're going to need a lot more ammunition. I think all of that is going to be prerequisite to any kind of substantive, successful offensive operations by the Ukrainian army. Now, it could be that there's an area of the front where the Russians are just weak, maybe too many Mobics, bad logistics, whatever. So you could see some opportunistic offensives in places like that. But I suspect those are going to be relatively limited. Right now, the Russians are pretty well fortified in Donbass, and along the Dnieper River. So both of those are probably going to be unlikely candidates. It's more likely you'll see something around northern Donbass, sort of around Kramatorsk. The Ukrainians have still been pushing around there in the hope of kind of cutting off some of the forces, some of the Russian forces fighting in and around Bakhmut from a highway or a road anyway. That's a major logistical artery. But the Ukrainians haven't been too successful in that offensive. They've been meeting about as much success as the Russians in Bakhmut. More likely, I think, if the Ukrainians do build up the necessary provisions and manpower and vehicles for an offensive, it's going to be in Zaporizhia Oblast or Oblast. I can never remember how to pronounce Oblast. But that's sort of that land bridge that Russia has between Crimea and eastern Ukraine. That's a more attractive target, I suspect, because there's not nearly as many natural defensive lines there. The terrain is not nearly as conducive. It's basically just open plains. So it'll be much easier for the Ukrainian army to attack there than it will be, say, across the Dnieper River or into Crimea or into, say, Donbass. But yeah, Crimea, I don't think is going to be nearly as attractive. And I think really there's going to be a strong incentive for the Ukrainian army, well, the Ukrainian government rather, to trade Crimea away, which I know is not going to be a very popular, that's not, Ukrainians are not going to like that idea. But really, I suspect something like Donbass for Crimea is going to be pretty attractive to negotiators. Ideally, Ukraine would be able to just liberate all of the territory Russia has taken, but that's going to be a heavy lift, and that's going to take a long time. So I suspect if there is going to be a negotiated settlement before 2024, Donbass for Crimea would probably be, I would imagine, a pretty likely outcome. But we're not there yet. The Ukrainians are still fighting hard. They're still building up their army. There's still a lot of headwinds that the Russian army has to face. They've got a lot of logistical problems heading their way, even after all of the ones they've solved thus far. All of that Western pressure in terms of manufactured goods and intermediate goods, that's going to start taking a toll. So it's really not clear yet just what the outcome of the war is going to be. So it's entirely possible, not particularly likely, but it's entirely possible that Ukraine could build up its army enough to eject the Russian army at some point. That would require very favorable outcomes on certain questions. It would require the Russian army to continue to underperform. It would require the Ukrainian army to really continue overachieving. It would require a lot of material. It would require a lot of support, etc. But it is possible. So until we kind of see how some of those unknown variables play out over the course of the next year and probably into 2024, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to tell whether or not Ukraine will realistically be able to reconquer Crimea. So the unsatisfying answer to this question is, I don't know. That's the short version. But in my defense, nobody does. Nobody can really say for sure.
Well, people will act like they do.
Oh, of course. Let's see. Given that Russia and Ukraine each have birth rates well below replacement and are now in the process of killing each other, what might the future trajectories of the countries look like? Could Russia fracture into multiple ethno-states? It's not that bad. It's not that bad. Russia has taken heavy casualties, but the casualties are heavily focused on ethnic minorities and also ethnic Russians whom are from some of the poorer regions of Russia. So, even though they've taken heavy casualties, this is not going to, even if, for one, they have not taken casualties heavy enough to influence demographics. It's not, they haven't taken, what is it, it's about maybe 100K casualties thus far. And a lot of those are injuries. So what is it, maybe 30K fatalities. So, Russia is still a country of 50 million people. And that's going to leave, 50,000 casualties is a lot, especially for a modern war, but it's not going to be enough to really put a dent in the ethnic Russian population, even if it was mostly Russians doing the dying. But as is, the dying is skewed heavily towards, Tuvans, Buryatians, Dagestanis, These kinds of ethnic minorities people don't really think of when they think of Russia actually are disproportionately represented in the front line amongst infantry. So it's more them who are going to kind of bear the brunt there demographically. But even then, I don't think it's really going to be enough to crimp them significantly. So, demographics are going to be okay. And Ukraine is in the same boat. I almost said the Ukraine. Do you remember when I said Zelensky gave a speech
Yep.
in Washington? So Nancy Pelosi, whom was then still House Majority Leader, introduced him by referring to him as the president of the Ukraine.
Oh no.
And immediately I noted it. Immediately I said, oh, she's going to get in trouble for that. It's supposed to be Ukraine, not the Ukraine. I don't think anybody really complained, though. I didn't hear anything after the fact, but in my head I knew people in Ukraine were going to feel slighted by it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think, to answer the question, I don't think the trajectory of the demographics of either Ukraine or Russia is going to be significantly impacted, given casualties thus far. I think you would need a lot more in terms of fatalities in order to really have an impact there. And then as far as Russia fracturing into multiple ethno-states, very unlikely. The ethnic minorities are not really large enough. I think Russia is still 80% ethnic Russian, and the 20% that is not ethnic Russian is heavily fractured. There's not any single ethnic group that dominates that. It's divided amongst like 20, 30 different ethnic groups. So, even if the power of the Russian state were to start to crumble, it would have to crumble significantly for any of those autonomous republics in which one or the other ethnic group has a near majority for them to be anywhere near having the strength to declare independence. So I don't think it's very likely. It would be a heavy lift for them to do that. Do you have any thoughts on Bitcoin and its impact on global power imbalances regarding sanctions, SWIFT, Fed's ability to continue the bubble economy when people now have an escape from the ever-weakening dollar? So specifically Bitcoin, I don't think it really matters that much. I mean, Bitcoin is useful for circumventing sanctions, but it's actually quite possible just to use normal smuggling networks for that. It's if you want to buy something that you're not supposed to buy because of sanctions, the easiest way to do it is just to go to a third-party country that is not sanctioning you and just set up some kind of shell company or otherwise operate through some kind of third-party intermediary and have them buy the stuff for you and then sell it to you, probably at some kind of premium. And then you can just import it back to your country, in this case, Russia. So that sounds very simplistic, but that's actually like the main way sanctions busting happens. And it's very difficult to enforce sanctions in third-party countries that are not participating in the sanctions. The US have tools to do that. Those are called secondary sanctions. So those involve sanctioning entities in third-party countries that are, breaching sanctions and selling stuff that they're not supposed to sell to them, that you don't want them to sell to them. But in that case, that just pushes the activity into the black market. So, a lot of the intermediaries that smugglers operate in are developing countries. And of course, in developing countries, the administrative capacity of the governments to enforce sanctions, even if they want to enforce them, is limited. So that leaves lots of room to operate for organized criminals, smugglers, or, intelligence agencies, foreign intelligence agencies. Like all kinds of malefactors can take advantage of that lack of administrative capacity, as well as, corruption. You can always just bribe a guy at, whatever agency responsible for customs or enforcement of sanctions or whatever. So it's just relatively easy to operate there and abuse the government's lack of capacity. So in that case, even if the government in the third-party country is trying to help the United States enforce sanctions, they're probably not going to realistically be able to. And in that sense, Russia will probably still be able to import stuff that it needs. The value of sanctions in that sense is not preventing them from getting what they need. It's more in reducing their ability to get as much of what they need as cheaply. So basically, sanctions serve to force them to buy less of what they need at a premium. And in that sense, it puts a dent in their ability to manufacture the stuff they need in order to continue to prosecute the war in Ukraine. But it was never realistic that sanctions were just going to stop it completely. There's a lot of things we can do and a lot of things we're probably going to do in 2023 in order to tighten sanctions. But, as much as we can tighten them, it's still going to just be an impediment rather than a block. You can see that with Iran. Iran is still able to get stuff that they need. They can still import, all of the equipment and whatnot. They just can't import very much of it, and they have to pay a lot for it. And actually, it's the premium that's more problematic for them because Iran doesn't have a lot of money these days. If they had a smaller population, it would be easier. But as is, they've got, whatever it is, 80, 90 million people. So all that oil revenue has to get split up amongst so many people that it ends up getting watered down to the point where it doesn't go very far. So that's the problem that Russia is going to have. They'll be able to get what they need, but not as much, and it'll cost them more. I skipped a question. Okay. Oh, and I should say, if I ever don't answer anybody's question to their satisfaction, or if I miss the point of a question, feel free to ask again. I'm happy to return to it, take another crack at it. So let's see. Long-time listener, first-time question asker, new topic. This is the biggest issue that has come up in the USA in the last weeks. Hats, what is your take on the political reasoning for the college football national championship to not have tailgating? Do you believe that Democratic California enacted this policy just to ruin two typically Republican fan bases in University of Georgia and Texas Christian University? Alas, I am not particularly sports-minded, so I can't say I've followed this. So the answer to this question is I don't know. Yeah, I haven't even really been following hockey much anymore.
Oh, man.
I used to be more into that. How have the Kraken been doing?
I think they've been relatively good, not quite as good as the Vegas team when they first made their debut.
The Golden Knights.
Yeah, the Golden Knights, they got all the way to the Stanley Cup their first year, something crazy.
Yeah, they did. Haven't been anywhere close since, but they did do really well that first year. Yeah, they had some player management problems. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. Yeah, I don't know. I doubt it. Probably has more to do with, I mean, if I had to guess, and I do, it probably has more to do with misbehavior by the fans. If they're having problems with people getting drunk and getting into altercations, I suspect that would be the impetus there. But again, the questioner would probably know better than I. Let's see. Regarding economics, Austrian versus Keynesianism. Oh, that's a fun question. I don't have any particular dog in the fight. I'm not particularly ideologically minded these days. At this point, I just want to see I would just want to see public policy done well. That's so rare these days. Just whatever you want to do, just do it well. Have it be a well-designed policy. That would be great. I don't really care if it's, one or the other party or one of the other purpose or ideology. Just having something that sets out to achieve a particular goal and is well designed in achieving that goal and then actually achieves the goal. That would be really cool. I'll take that. But yeah, as far as Austrianism versus Keynesianism, it's kind of an outdated debate because Austrianism kind of evolved into monetarism and then into kind of a more quantitative scientific approach to economics generally. So at this point, it's more technical than it is philosophical or ideological. And then Keynesianism kind of evolved along the same track. So Keynesianism isn't really even a thing anymore. Now it's neo-Keynesianism. And even that has kind of evolved into very quantitative, into a more quantitative field, so to speak. I mean, really, economics in general has become so quantitative that it's almost more of a technical field than a political field, in a sense. So these arguments about, Keynesianism versus Austrianism, they're a little bit obsolete in a sense. Not entirely. There are definitely still economists who affiliate with one or the other and produce research that kind of advocates for one or the other. But because the field is so technical, it's become much easier to critique works like that that are explicitly ideological. And it's become much more difficult to really shill, so to speak. If you want to shill for an ideology, you work for a think tank, specifically a advocacy outfit. That's more where you see a lot of the ideologically charged research that is kind of designed in a way to achieve a particular outcome, to produce a particular result. But the actual academic field of economics is much better at that. The debate is much more cordial and is much more authentic and rigorous.
That's one of the differences between TV debates and academic debates. Is academic debates, if you trip up one sentence and the logic doesn't flow, they will all get on you at that point. And you basically have to win that argument to proceed. Whereas with TV debates, you can say like 3 minutes of just pure bullshit. And it's a strategy that's pretty well known now, that you can just fill your time slot with so much bullshit that they can't, in their time slot, address all of it and counter all of it. But in academia, it doesn't work that way because people have to write shit down with papers. And if you actually want to get published and like have good backing for your stuff, then it has to stand up to scrutiny. So it's a little bit more painstaking and detail oriented in academia. Yeah, Gish Gallop is what it's called. When you just throw a flurry of really bad arguments and they don't have enough time in their slot to be able to counter all of them. And a lot of times the audience, that's another difference too, is the audience of a TV debate is different from the audience of an academic debate. Because academic debate, Agent Smith would know better than I for this because you've gone further in academia, but you've got like the professors, you've got the people who are like recently graduated, and then you've got a bunch of grad students, and everybody is like really deep in literature most of the time. And it's less about the feelings of who's winning the hearts and minds of people, and it's more so just like the logic of who's technically correct.
Yeah, I kind of miss those debates back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
There's always workshops, and in grad school anyway, well, at universities, there's always, workshops, conferences, seminars, there's always something going on. And, it kind of was nice to be able to just kind of be enveloped in that kind of environment where, people were being very rigorous in their debates, their data, and what have you. Kind of wished that they hadn't been so early in the damn morning.
Yeah.
Definitely resented that. I was never an early riser, and all of those workshops and seminars were always at like 8, 9 a.m. in the morning.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Mornings.
But it was good stuff. Yeah, if you're interested in politics or public policy, and you would like to have a, shall we say, more nutritional news feed, if you would like to have a higher quality of media that you consume in that vein, then I would recommend, God help you, but God help me rather. I would recommend getting onto Twitter and following think tanks. Preferably like good ones. There's some that are kind of just explicitly political, but if you can find some that are relatively more objective, none of them are like completely objective. There's always, donors have influence, so that's always a thing. But, find some of the better think tanks, follow them. And, you don't have to read everything they post, but the stuff they post is generally going to be more academically minded. They're generally going to have like briefs, papers, working papers, stuff like that they'll summarize. And they'll actually, use real data and relatively decent argumentation. And so in that sense, if you're getting more of your news in that way, you're going to have a better grounding as far as public policy debates and stuff. Because I can tell you right now, like, if you're just watching cable television pundits, especially, then you're not really informing yourself. Those people are very much, I don't want to say they're explicitly trying to manipulate their audience, but they're very much a part of the political ecosystem, right? Much more so than the academic ecosystem.
Yeah, they're not trying to manipulate their audience. What they're trying to do is manipulate their audience.
Well, yeah, I guess, yeah, it's kind of redundant in that sense. But yeah, they're political actors. Like there's a whole ecosystem of political actors. Politicians obviously are in that system, but there's also people in the media, people in advocacy think tanks and whatnot. All of those people kind of are on the same team. PR, public relations firms also, all of them have the same objective, which is to engineer political outcomes. They want to try to sell a political product and get you to support it and vote for it. So that's a little different than the analytical side of things, which is more what think tanks do. They're more interested in generating data, conclusions, etc. And again, there are think tanks that specialize in producing data for that political ecosystem to use and abuse. But the better think tanks produce data for institutions like the US government, or even, foreign governments, NGOs, industry, etc. So think tanks that specialize in catering to those clients generally produce better data, better papers, and have more solid conclusions, more reliable work in general, because their work is not being judged on its ability to compel people to donate to one or the other political party, or get angry and vote for one or the other political party. Their work is judged more on its quality, just the actual quality of the academic work. Because if you're a company, you want real solid advice. You need solid information so that you don't invest, billions of dollars and then find out, oh, I did it wrong. So now the shareholders are screwed. I'm screwed. Everybody's screwed. You don't want that. So you do want solid analysis. So the think tanks that cater more to that clientele are a little more reliable. So try to find them, not subscribe, but follow them on Twitter. And generally the briefs and stuff that they post online is pretty good. So that's generally better for it's not just better for in terms of getting informed, it's also just better for your mental health. Because, the whole modus operandi for a lot of media, a lot of political media and politicized media is just to get you upset. Because upset people are better voters, right? They're more reliable voters. But with the think tanks and the academic side of things, it's not really about that. They don't really care if you're angry or upset or whatever. It's much more about informing people. Generally, that, there is some advocacy that goes on there. And you can kind of see that in the choices of the kinds of topics that they research. The Brookings Institution, I noted, really went really hard in 2020 on things like inclusivity, racial equity, etc. Much more so than other think tanks. So it's clear that, they were very much focused on that, either because the researchers themselves were interested or because that's just where the donors were. So, there is some bias there in terms of choosing topics, but generally the work that they produce is pretty decent. Even if they are kind of trying to sell something to a degree there, the logic and reasoning is a better quality than what you would see, say, on, Tucker Carlson or MSNBC or something like that.
Yeah, they're like the TV shows are entertainment businesses. They're actually, yeah. I feel like using politics as a way to have consistently spicy content, but that's not really the essence of what they're bringing to the table. They do have power in the political sphere, but I feel like they're not really out to, as accurately as possible, convey the news. It's more so to fire people up and get good ratings. That's their real win condition.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all we had for questions.
Nice. Got about 45 minutes-ish.
Gotcha.
Time still.
So I was alt-tabbing out and I saw somebody in chat asking for some recommendations. Like whatever I say is going to get me in trouble, because there's always going to be people who say, oh, well, that's affiliated with this, that, or the other party and whatever. So, there's no think tank you can follow that is completely unbiased or is completely untainted by politics. Mm-hmm. But some of the better ones are probably Brookings Institution, Center for Strategic and International Studies. CFR is pretty deep, Council of Foreign Relations. Some of the Illuminati people don't like them, but overall they do good work. What was it? Cato Institute does pretty good. So if you can look past all of their ranting about the Jones Act, I think every time I check my Twitter feed, there's something from Cato about the Jones Act. Yeah, Cato is definitely more libertarian minded, but the argumentation that they produce is higher quality than what you'll see elsewhere. There's another libertarian one that was supposed to be pretty decent. It slips my mind. But yeah, Brookings, CSIS, those Cato, all pretty decent. And you got me curious. Who do I follow on Twitter? I think you can actually see it on my Twitter profile. Or is that not public?
I don't think you can see who someone follows unless you like mutually follow each other, maybe.
Gotcha. Profile. Oh, that's right. I follow. So you can also follow individual academics, if you're interested in their particular specialty, whatever it is, whatever field it is that they're focused on. So one of the ones I liked was Kori Schake. I used to listen to her on, there's a website called Foreign Policy, and they used to have a podcast. And so the guy that owned the website was also a foreign policy expert who had actually served in the Clinton administration. And, in his podcast, he would get people from, different backgrounds. So Kori Schake was actually sort of the representation of conservatives, right? She had a more conservative outlook. And, of the conservatives I've heard comment on foreign policy, Kori Schake was definitely one of the best. And so I went out of my way to kind of follow her in particular, because I already hear a lot of foreign policy perspectives from the left, just through the media, through online, whatnot. So you sometimes don't always see the conservative perspective. So I wanted to try to get her in there so I could get a high quality representative there.
Correction from the chat. You can see who someone is following on Twitter. And someone link that so they can see who you're following.
Oh, Rand Corporation. That was another one I had. Yeah, the Rand Corporation does a lot of really good stuff. Yeah, that's about all I follow. I'm sure there's plenty others out there. You can really, one of the nice things about Twitter, and I know it's weird to say nice things about Twitter, but one of the nice things about Twitter is that you can really make it a curated experience, and it can actually be a pretty high quality one if you're careful about who you're following. So if you're interested in a very particular public policy topic, that's actually really helpful because that can help you narrow down who you follow. You can really focus on academics who are focusing on that topic, and as well as think tanks, and then just follow them. And if you do that, then your Twitter feed will just be full of cool stuff. Like every day, you'll just get cool updates about topics that you're interested in, and it'll all be like substantive analysis, predicated on actual experience, predicated on data analysis, predicated on like methodology and critiques. Like it's just a much better experience than what you'll get trying to kind of understand something by way of a television pundit or a news anchor or what have you. And really, it also gives you a little bit of foresight because a lot of the research done by think tanks ends up filtering its way into more mainstream forms of media months later. So, you like normally when television pundits or whatever start, ranting about something, they'll frequently be citing research that's produced by think tanks. And generally that research will have been produced several months before. So, if you follow think tanks, sometimes if you follow them closely anyway, you'll pick up on all the data they produce, and frequently you'll be able to kind of predict what media will be talking about, within a couple months, because generally that's how long it takes for the people who work for television studios and whatnot to kind of process that information and write up a script and then, produce something.
So you're saying people get their news with huge lag if they watch it on TV?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. What else? Oh, I had the 2023 guide thing. Almost forgot about it. But was there anything else you kind of wanted to get to?
I don't think so. What do you mean, this guide thing?
Well, I just kind of drew up some items that I wrote down, some notes about stuff that was going to happen in specific months in 2023. And so I had the idea of trying to kind of pool all of those together just to give a quick guide to what we can expect during certain periods of 2023, things that will probably be in the news and that will probably drive events or narratives, at least.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So call it foreshadowing, if you like.
Stuff to watch out for.
Yeah. Well, this first item is kind of obsolete now. So I had read that natural gas stores in Europe would start running out in the sort of late winter, early spring, but the weather has actually warmed up pretty considerably in Europe recently, so that may not actually be a problem. Well, yeah. Also, late winter, early spring, China may change gears on COVID. So they recently ended zero COVID in China, following, the protests that we talked about, sort of in, I think it was December. But since then, there's been rapid contagion. The virus has been spreading just everywhere. Like all of the people I know in China have contracted COVID, like in the past month and change. And everybody in their families has contracted it. Like it's just everywhere.
So they went
It's
from
just
zero COVID to all the COVID.
all the COVID, yeah. So that's put a pretty big strain on the healthcare sector in China. Because it really, in a lot of ways, China is still a developing country, even with all of the strides they've made. And this massive crush of people coming in needing healthcare, needing ventilators and other forms of medical care has just outstripped their ability to provide it. And so there could be a reversal here of the reversal. I don't think they're going to go back to zero COVID, but they may implement some new measures here just to try to inhibit the death toll. The government has been very cagey about how many people are dying, but it's probably like a lot. It's a country of 1 billion people, so that even if it's a small percentage of people getting infected who are going on to then die, that's going to add up really fast in a country of 1 billion people. We already saw that with India.
Mm-hmm.
India didn't get very hard in 2020, but in 2021, with the Delta variant, they got slammed really badly. And the government probably was suppressing the real numbers, but even the fake numbers were like hundreds of thousands of people dead.
Mm-hmm.
So more likely, it's probably around 1 million or so, maybe even more than that, who died in India on account of the Delta variant and COVID generally. So there's probably going to be similar numbers in China. China's a little more developed than India, probably has a little better healthcare infrastructure, but it's not that much more advanced. So we can probably expect a similar death toll in this case. So that could lead to some reversals, and if there are reversals, that could lead to more public agitation. In other words, protests. So that's something to keep an eye on over the next couple months. And then in February, there's going to be a presidential election in Nigeria. And that's going to be interesting. Because the current president is Muhammad Buhari. And he had actually been president of Nigeria in the 1990s. And before he'd been president, he was actually dictator. So he was dictator, and then he democratized the political system, and then won election, and then later on lost. And then he was gone for a while. And then I think what, 10 years ago or so, whenever it was, he was able to win election again. And, this time he promised that he was going to end corruption and he was going to instigate economic development and he was going to do all this, that, and the other. And, surprising nobody, he didn't really do much of any of it. Nigeria isn't really that much better off now than it was when he took office again for his second bout in power. So people are pretty cynical, probably, overall. And, that doesn't even get into, the pandemic, the SARS protests. The SARS protests were a whole thing. I don't even remember if we talked about that. SARS stands for Special Anti-Robbery something. I forget what the last S stands for. But basically, it was a special police unit that was created in order to tackle robberies, violent robberies especially, which had become a problem in Nigeria. And so they created this unit to try to deal with it. And big surprise, not only did they fail to tackle robberies, they ended up mostly just stealing from people themselves. So obviously that upset people. And this was an institution that had been around a while. This was not like a new thing. And so there had been tension building over all of the, shakedowns and what would you call it? Extortion that was being committed by this special police unit. And eventually in 2020, I think it was in 2020, maybe it was in 2019, but there were some big protests in Nigeria, especially by young people, against the SARS unit. And that resulted in a crackdown, and the protests didn't really go anywhere. But it did create some bad blood there between young voters in particular, especially in urban areas, against the Buhari government. So Buhari himself is not going to run again. I think he's maxed out his terms. There's a 2-term limit, I think. So he's going to step down, I believe, and somebody else is going to run. But the issue, more so than people being cynical and upset at, Buhari and the lack of progress, is more just the general decline in security in Nigeria, especially in northern Nigeria. So there's been a lot of problems with nomadic peoples clashing with farmers, owing partly to climate change. There's been a lot of climate issues there that have been negatively impacting the nomadic peoples, which has resulted in them moving into lands that farmers more populate. And so they've been competing for resources. And that's fed a general rise in criminality. And when I say general rise in criminality, I don't mean like a marginal rise in criminality. Like they've got full-on bandit armies operating in northern Nigeria right now. One of them almost shot down a government plane at one point. So the organized crime and bandit groups have become a major security issue in northern Nigeria, as bad, if not worse, than what was that Boko Haram, that Islamist group that kidnapped all those girls back in the day. So that's, between Boko Haram and the bandit armies and all of that in the north, like Nigeria has some major issues to tackle. And so in the south, then they've got a nascent separatist movement in the, what was it, the Igbo territory. Was it Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa? Yeah, I think it's Igbo. So there had actually been a separatist movement there way back in the 60s and 70s, but it was crushed by the government violently in a somewhat short but brutal civil war around 1969, I want to say. And separatist sentiment has been on the wane since then, but it's made a minor comeback more recently, especially with the government kind of losing some of its legitimacy. And then there's also been, what was it? Oh, just like in general, in urban areas, people have been getting more upset with the government. So between discontent and separatists in the south, and then general breakdown in order in the north, conditions in Nigeria have gotten a lot worse over the past 5 years or so. So whoever runs for office is going to have their hands full when they run, but that just makes it all the more interesting to see who's going to try to take on the challenge and see how they plan on doing that. So definitely keep an eye on Nigeria for the February election. Nigeria is the keystone country in West Africa. As goes Nigeria, so does West Africa. And the kind of security issues Nigeria has been experiencing in the north of their country is the same kind of problem that countries all along the Sahel have been experiencing. And most of those countries are not nearly as big or well resourced as the Nigerian government.
Yeah, I
So if
pulled up the
Nigeria,
map and I don't recognize a lot of them or know much about them. Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, I have heard of before. Some people I've met in France are from there. Liberia used to be called Monrovia. I saw a documentary on that one. Sierra Leone, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, Senegal, and Nigeria looks like it's on that like upper cusp of where the lush green part of Africa meets the Sahara. So maybe it
yeah,
has
that's
some
the
desertous region in the north.
semi-arid. That's the Sahel. It's kind of savanna. So lots of grass, very few trees.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of hard to grow a lot there. So the people there tend to be more nomadic.
Mm-hmm.
That tends to be more cattle and grazing rather than actual farming. And so that's the area where the conditions have been deteriorating for the grazers,
Mm-hmm.
for the cattlemen and what the herders, I should say. And so they've been pushing more south to where the farmers are. That's created some issues. But yeah, if Nigeria cannot handle these problems, then it's not likely that the other countries in the region will be able to, because Nigeria actually does quite a bit to try to help stabilize countries in the region when they have issues. But if Nigeria itself becomes destabilized, then that's probably not going to happen. And so these problems in the Sahel regarding Islamist groups and bandits and whatnot, they're probably going to get a lot worse.
Hmm.
So it definitely behooves everybody in the region, if not also outside of the region, to try to ensure that the Nigerian state is able to maintain its integrity and is able to kind of try to address some of these issues and mitigate their worst excesses. Yeah, a little trivia for you. Most of your chocolate comes from here in this region.
Hmm.
A lot of it grown by child slaves of one sort or another, fortunately.
Not the most ethically sourced then.
No, it's not. I'm afraid not. But so it goes. Yeah, I would also point out that countries along the Sahel are struggling on account of, the herders versus farmers issue and the bandits and whatnot. But the coastal areas are doing better. Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast isn't really struggling that much. And Ghana is still a standout. Ghana is actually more successful than even Nigeria in West Africa. Nigeria is easily the most powerful country in West Africa, but Ghana is actually the most wealthy. They've got the most successful economy and have experienced the most economic growth in the region
What do they make
over
money
the
from?
past half century. What?
What do they make money from?
They used to make money from gold, and I think they still do to a degree. But over the past half century, they've managed to diversify their economy into other areas. Some manufacturing, but more so services. They've actually done pretty good at producing uh, human capital. Relatively educated workforce for the region, and so they've been able to attract relatively more investment from some of the companies that are higher in the value chain of Western manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
So well, not manufacturing per se, but well, like Facebook, for example, chose Ghana instead of Nigeria for their Africa branch headquarters. So that's an example of the kind of investment they're able to attract because they have one, better human capital, relatively educated workers and whatnot, but also because it's relatively more stable there. The political system has been pretty reliable since independence, much more so than the countries around Ghana. So that's resulted and contributed to the success of the economy there. They even have their own little space program.
Nice.
Yeah, they're not going to the moon or anything, but they do have a space program designed to launch satellites into space. So they're trying to kind of get a niche in the commercial space industry in that way. So
That's
yeah,
cool.
yeah, they're doing really well. Go Ghana. Let's see. So let's see. That's late winter, spring, and then spring, summer. Well, we already talked about Ukraine. That's not news. So Ukraine should start getting deliveries of the small diameter bombs we talked about. Do
Mm-hmm.
you remember that? We talked about that a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
So they should start. So you'll start hearing about those in the news around then. And the Ukrainian army may or may not do something in Zaporizhia. We kind of already talked about that as well. And then I also read that some of the increases in manufacturing capacity should start paying off in the United States as far as ammunition. And so there should be a decent uptick in ammunition deliveries to Ukraine. It's not going to be a big increase from what I was reading, maybe like 1/3 or so increase from what we were doing before, but you know, that's going to be, well, it's better than nothing for one, but it's going to give the Ukrainian army greater capabilities. They
Mm-hmm.
won't have to ration as much and they'll be able to save more for some kind of, well, not a major offensive, but smaller localized offensives. Let's see, spring, summer 2023. Oh, yeah, this is going to be a big one. So the Supreme Court is going to rule on a case involving independent state legislature theory. Yeah, we've talked about this before. We actually talked about this last year when it first got onto the docket. This is going to involve determining the degree to which states can determine how their electoral votes are allocated. Uh, Historically, there's been, some notion that the feds could require you uh, to meet certain preconditions. Basically, you can't just be a dictatorship. You can't just have allocate your electoral votes in a way that is not, at least to some degree, representative of the vote, of the actual presidential vote. But there is some notion here being argued, and this is what the independent state legislature theory argues, that states can allocate them however they want, because in the Constitution of the United States, it stipulates that states have, well, specifically state legislatures, have final say over allocation of electoral votes. Now, if the Supreme Court does rule in favor, or in a way that favors independent state legislature theory, that's going to open up a lot of doors as far as disenfranchising people. It's going to make it a lot easier to manipulate the outcome of a presidential vote in favor of one or the other party, regardless of the vote. Now, what I think doesn't really matter here. I didn't think that the Supreme Court would strike down abortion rights. So, what the hell do I know? Apparently nothing. But for what it's worth, I'm a little skeptical here that the Supreme Court would rule on this. Even disregarding whatever Thomas is saying, just because in this case the state legislature actually is kind of in breach of the state constitution, which is kind of more the problem there. So I'm a little dubious about the veracity of these attempts to try to change how electoral votes are being distributed, given that it was unconstitutional even in North Carolina. So I imagine that's going to receive some attention during the back and forth debate between, well, not debate, but during the comments between the relevant lawyers and the Supreme Court justices. But we'll see. Regardless of the outcome, it's going to be a big deal. So there's going to be not inconsiderable drama around summer 2023 when this case rolls around and the Supreme Court has a final ruling on it. And let's see. Also, well, this kind of is obvious, but after the first quarter, we're going to, surprise, get the first quarter Fed's job report. That's predictable, but it's going to be a big deal here because it's going to help determine the direction of inflation. The Fed has already said that they're going to start cutting back on the rate increases. They haven't said that they're going to stop increasing rates, but they have said that the amount by which they increase them is going to fall, and they're going to do that for a couple months in the early going here of 2023, just to kind of see what effect it has. They don't want to blow up the economy, but they do want to slow it down to ease inflation. But whether or not they can actually do both is debatable. So the compromise is that the Fed is going to keep increasing rates, but at a slower pace. And then they're going to see what the economy looks like after the first quarter, after the second quarter or so, and then judge where to go from there. So after the first quarter, we're going to kind of get a rough idea whether or not the economy is slowing with the jobs report. And if it does seem like hiring is slowing down, that's going to suggest that the Fed is going to maintain the slower pacing of rate increases, or maybe even just keep them still. But if the jobs keep coming, if the economy does keep hiring at a pretty decent clip, you're probably going to see the Fed, well, there's a decent chance, I'll say, that you'll see the Fed actually reverse their decision here and go back to the big rate hikes. There's been a lot of debate within the Fed over the past 10 years about whether or not rates need to be relatively high or low. And for a long time, they were just low because the economy was kind of underperforming. But now that it's heating up considerably, the more hawkish faction in the Fed is kind of getting their day. The people who were more dovish on inflation had kind of initially had their way. They were the ones who wanted to not raise interest rates immediately as inflation was taking off as the economy recovered after the pandemic in 2021. And obviously, they were wrong about inflation. And so the result is that the hawks are now in the driver's seat. And their perspective has always been that when the economy is doing well, they should hike interest rates, not only to ensure inflation does not become a problem, but also to ensure that when the economy eventually does suffer a downturn, that they have somewhere to go. If your interest rate is at 0.5% and then you have a recession, you can't really lower your interest rate very much, and so that limits that tool as far as its effectiveness and as far as the Fed's ability to actually do something countercyclical in response to a recession. So the inflation hawks have always wanted to raise interest rates back up for that reason. They want to get them high so that they have more room to lower them in response to a downturn. So that's partly driving inflation hikes. And again, if data after the first quarter, and probably more so after the second quarter, to be fair, is still suggesting strong economic growth, you're probably going to see some big hikes afterwards, which may or may not tank the economy. The economy is acting squirrely. As we've talked about here before, the state of the economy and how it's structured, not only in the United States, but around the world, has changed dramatically because of innovation and technologies and whatnot over the past couple decades. And also, over the past couple decades, we've had unprecedented, stability and predictability in the economy. So the result is that we have not had a lot of stimuli affecting the economy at the same time that it's been changing a lot. And the result is that economists don't really know how it's going to react to given stimuli. We don't have enough precedent there to make good predictions. So the result is that, even professional economists don't really know what to make of the economy right now. So we're just kind of having to learn on the fly, so to speak, and hope we don't accidentally blow up the economy in the process. So that's also something to watch in 2023, whether or not the economy implodes. It's unlikely, but there's an outside chance. We can't entirely rule it out either. Given how much inflation there's been, you would think that the economy would be slowing faster than it is. But it's actually been weirdly robust, and economists don't entirely know what to make of that or what to do about it. So, join us on that journey. We're all learning together at this point. Let's see, spring-summer 2023 UK is going to try to pass an online safety bill, which is going to have which is going to implement a lot of restrictions on a lot of the internet, broadly speaking. The idea is that they want to try to protect children from indecent material, bullying, etc., the usual rigmarole. And this bill has been kind of negotiated and debated and kicked around in London for a while now. I think over a year, maybe a couple of years now. And there's always been critics who don't like the idea of the government stepping in and requiring things like age verification. One of the provisions in the bill originally was that if you wanted to see something like adult material, then adult websites would have to verify the age of the person viewing the material. And there was a whole company, that basically sprung up overnight that offered that as a service, as a third-party vendor. They would offer service where you could put in something like a driver's license or whatever, and then they would verify that you were of a certain age, and then would allow, the client, in this case, the adult company, to then allow, whoever person to view the material. But a lot of people didn't like that. They didn't like the idea of a third-party vendor having access to their personal data. They felt like it would basically just be a way of recording all of the web traffic, that you were in, that all of the websites you were visiting. And so campaigners, basically privacy campaigners, shot it down. And so the bill has been negotiated and renegotiated over and over again, trying to find a way to protect children, but in a way that also respects privacy. And the balance between the two has not really yet been struck. But there has been progress made. And from what I read, the bill is set to be passed this summer. Maybe there are further delays and it doesn't happen. Who's to say? Wouldn't be surprising, but nominally it should be passed this summer. So you could see a lot of debate online and in the news about the best way to protect children, and also how to do an age verification system that still respects privacy. That's all pending in the summer, especially in the UK, if that bill does in fact get passed. And I would also point out that if it gets passed in the UK, there's probably going to be a lot of lobbying in the United States to do something similar. So it's worth pointing out for that reason as well. So that'll be a part of the political diet, so to speak, in political media in the United States this summer. In June, Turkey has its presidential election, and oh boy, that's going to be exciting. Recep Erdogan is running for re-election, and if you know anything about Mr. Erdogan, you know that he is very power hungry, and there's not a lot he's not willing to do to hang on to power. And, that's always been true to a degree, really. But what's new this time is that the AKP, his party, has lost some support. They're not doing as well. They lost the control. They lost the mayorship of Istanbul, the largest city in Turkey, to an opposition candidate. And in general, they haven't been polling as well. So, what happens in a democracy when a party isn't polling as well and they have an election coming up? Well, you get political theater. We were already talking about that earlier. So Erdogan in particular is known for his political theatrics, sometimes violent Machiavellian theatrics. So if his party continues to poll poorly leading up to the election, he's going to do something. I don't know what, but it's probably going to be something that's going to make BBC World News. I can tell you that. So definitely keep an eye on Turkey's presidential election. Just the way things are looking, it's looking like he's going to have to do something dramatic to win support from nationalists in order to get the votes he needs. And that could be newsworthy, and probably will be. Let's see. Also, oh yeah, we didn't really talk about this earlier, but Turkey had still been stonewalling on the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO, but apparently they did finally reach some kind of agreement. It was multifaceted, and it involved basically expelling certain former PKK members and changing some of the terrorism laws in Finland and Sweden, and this, that, or the other random thing. I suspect Erdogan doesn't actually care that much. I think he just wants something he can point to as a win for his campaign for the election coming up. But regardless, Turkey did agree to vote to allow Sweden and Finland into NATO. So the final vote should be in June. Is that what I was reading? Well, in the summer, I think is when they said. So Turkey will vote to allow, to ratify, I should say, Sweden and Finland's accession into NATO this summer. So we should have final word on that by then. Hungary may or may not still be stonewalling by then. I don't know. We'll see. But Turkey, at least, will no longer be a barrier. Yeah, I remember when Finland and Sweden first applied to join NATO. From what I was reading, it was looking like they would be in by, at least by fall 2022. And boy, was that wrong. They're still not in. Well, we'll see if they can get in this year. But at the very least, it's not going to happen for probably 6 months at the earliest. So let's see, fall 2023. So fall 2023, you'll see campaigning for the 2024 presidential election in the United States begin. I don't think anybody's looking forward to that. but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Latin America, I think, yeah, Argentina. Argentina has an election in October 2023. That probably won't necessarily have a big global impact, but it'll certainly be a big deal for Argentina. The current government has not really done itself a lot of favors. They're not too popular given the difficulties they've had in negotiating a deal with the IMF and otherwise dealing with the economy. I think it's over 50% inflation now. It's quite high. They don't have a lot of growth either. So it's looking like the opposition has the inside track to make some gains in the election coming up. But we'll see. Who's to say? What is it? The Peronists, I think, are the ones in power right now. They could well be able to hang on to power. I don't know that the opposition is all that popular either, because they also had a chance to deal with the economy and did not do great. So I don't know really who there is to vote for if you're looking for real substantive change in Argentina at this point. But keep an eye on that. Maybe an actual reformer wins that has an actual plan for solving problems there. If so, that would definitely be a boon for Argentina and Latin America as a whole, because Argentina has a pretty big economy and has a lot of untapped economic potential. Ooh, yeah, this is another good one. Have you ever heard of the Wessener Agreement?
Wessener, no.
So that is an obscure, it was an obscure to me anyway, an obscure international agreement by which there is a common set of rules governing export restrictions. So there are certain components and technologies that are used to produce certain highly regulated weapons and other materials that everybody agrees should be controlled. So these are like components for the construction of nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, etc. So this is the kind of stuff that most countries are signatories to treaties in which these technologies are heavily regulated. So in order to kind of have a common program and schedule for export controls of these technologies, there is a common treaty, an agreement called the Wessener Agreement, by which everybody gets together like once a year or whatever and negotiates changes to a special list of technologies and equipment and whatnot that everybody is supposed to control the export of. So, again, this historically has had more to do with weapons technologies, especially nuclear, but also missile technologies and whatnot, that countries just don't want people to have ready access to, either people or certain countries that are sanctioned. But normally it's a pretty sleepy agreement. It's not something that like makes the news ever. But as you may recall, late last year, the Biden administration in the United States announced a whole slew of new export restrictions targeting specifically microchips, but also some other technologies, specifically exported to China. So these export restrictions are probably going to have a pretty big impact on the ability of China's technology industry to grow, but they're not going to have a very significant impact overall unless the United States is able to get allied countries that also have significant ties to the microchip industry, specifically the semiconductor industry, to adopt similar export restrictions. So one of the big projects for the Biden administration in 2023 is going to be doing exactly that, lobbying countries like the Netherlands, Japan, South Korea, et cetera, countries that have decent sized semiconductor industries or industries peripheral to the semiconductor industry to implement similar export restrictions. Now that's going to be a heavy lift because even if all of those countries do have an incentive to participate in export restrictions of key technologies to China, since they're all nominally strategic rivals of China, the export restrictions that the Biden administration wants them to adopt are a lot more extensive. The revolutionary thing about Biden's export restrictions, as announced in late 2022, is not that we're restricting the flow of advanced technology per se. We were already restricting the most advanced technology to China, specifically related to the semiconductor industry. And we already had agreement with allied countries to implement similar export restrictions. What was new about Biden's export restrictions in late 2022 was that he expanded them to basically any and all advanced technologies involving semiconductors. So it wasn't just the bleeding edge of the industry that they were focusing on. In general, the Biden administration wants to cut China off from imports of anything that can be considered advanced. So not all of it, the lower end of the market will still be available for China and Chinese consumers. But anything that's advanced, anything that's relatively recent in terms of its generation, that stuff is what the Biden administration wants them cut off from. And it's that stuff that allied countries are very reluctant to participate in, to cut China off from, because that stuff is very lucrative for their semiconductor industries. Those are, easily growth leaders for those industries. And so governments like Japan's or South Korea's and whatnot, they're more than happy to participate in blocking China off from the cutting edge of the industry. But, the advanced stuff, just that's a much broader category, and it generates a lot more revenue for those industries. So as a result, allied countries have been a lot more reluctant to participate. So the Biden administration is going to lobby hard to get them on board. There's going to be carrots and sticks. They're probably going to threaten them a little bit with some secondary sanctions, but they're probably going to focus a lot more on things like maybe some market access in the United States. Fingers crossed, pretty unlikely, but that's the kind of thing that they could dangle. More likely, they're going to try to give them offsets, stuff like maybe subsidies of some kind or exemptions, tax breaks, whatever. They're just going to try to find something to kind of try to ease the pain of losing access to the China market. But one of the things they're going to do, besides all of that, is that they're going to push really hard for the Wessinger Agreement to include these export restrictions. It's not just, again, the highest tier. They're not just talking about expanding Wessinger to involve and develop export restrictions on the cutting edge of the semiconductor technology. The Biden administration wants the Wessinger Agreement expanded to all of the same technologies that the administration's export restrictions were expanded to. So this is going to be a heavy lift, because now, in this case, we're not just going to be trying to convince allied countries to implement similar export restrictions. We're going to be expanding those export restrictions to the entire world, effectively, to all of the signatories and participants to the Wessinger Agreement. So that's a much heavier diplomatic lift. And it's probably too ambitious. I doubt they'll really be able to make it happen, but they might be able to get a watered down agreement that significantly increases the Wessinger Agreement's scope to include, more of the key technologies, at least some categories of the technologies involved. But I doubt they'll be fully successful. But regardless of how successful they are, you'll probably be reading about the Wessinger Agreement this year, because the administration will probably invest a decent amount of political capital into making that happen. Because while the probability of success is not high, if they actually could get the Wessinger Agreement expanded to all of the technologies they want, that would be a big win for the United States. So, it's high risk, high reward. Let's put it like that. How are we doing on time?
Got about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Well, that's all I had for the 2023 guide. So that's just kind of a rough outline of just some miscellaneous items that are more or less scheduled for the next year. So that's all stuff that you can kind of look forward to seeing in your news feed at some point.
Nice. Not telling us how it's going to pan out, but that it will be action items that have been cooking up for a while, and we should see what's going to happen with them.
Yeah, you'll see television pundits talking about them.
Mm-hmm.
So people will argue about it, and there'll be a whole thing, and then it'll kind of run its course. There's talking points kind of have cycles that they run through. Mm-hmm. And so if you can kind of pick out which topics pundits pick up on, you can get a pretty good idea of what coverage will look like for given weeks or even months of a given year. Mm-hmm. So in so much as these issues that I've pointed out for 2023 become talking points and become subjects of debate by television pundits and other politicos, This is the kind of stuff that will be circulating through those cycles. That will be working their way sort of through the media pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I guess I don't have too much else. I was going to do a brief update on the Myanmar civil war. And there's a controversial judicial reform in Israel that's coming up.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading that it probably won't be passed, but it could be. So that could be drama if it does. I guess I could just do that real quick. So the Israeli judicial reform in question is basically going to be a new law that would allow the legislature to overturn the ruling of Israel's Supreme Court. So, as of now, the court's rulings are effectively final. But the reform that is being proposed would allow the legislature to, if they didn't like the reform, or if they didn't like the ruling rather, then they could just vote, and if they had enough votes, they could just overturn it, and that would be it. So obviously, this has some significance given that the prime minister, Netanyahu, is under criminal investigation, and it's possible those investigations could come before the Supreme Court. So as is, the legislature could just overturn a ruling against Netanyahu if they were to get their way here and get this reform passed. It also has significance because some hard-right settler parties were able to get into government after the recent election. And, one of the prices that Netanyahu had to pay in exchange for their support was to give them control over the, I'm not sure what it's called, basically Israel's Ministry of Internal Security. It's the ministry that's actually in charge of handling security in the occupied territories in Palestine. So you can imagine how problematic it is that, radical pro-settler people being in charge of the security apparatus that, controls Israeli troops and police in occupied territories would be, especially if you're pro-Palestinian or very critical of the occupation. So that being the case, it's quite possible that those radicals, the radical pro-settler politicians might do something ambitious, something unconstitutional or illegal or what have you, with their power in Palestine. And, if such a thing were to happen, it could easily end up before the Supreme Court. And with this proposed reform, if it were passed, they would be able to just ignore that and keep doing what they were doing. So there's some concern there on that count as well. So as is, the distribution of power within Israel's parliament actually favors Netanyahu's party, Likud, and the settler parties that he aligned with and that are in his coalition are relatively large, but they're nowhere near a majority of the coalition. They were basically enough to get him a majority in parliament, but otherwise they don't really have enough size to have the leverage they would need to force Likud to do something that they don't really want to do. So in this case, they were able to get their preferred ministries, but Likud itself is actually pretty lukewarm about this judicial reform. It's something that the settler parties are more pushing for. So it's looking likely that Likud will actually oppose the judicial reform. Now, that's not set in stone. Who's to say what'll happen? Maybe Netanyahu changes course here, but for the moment, it's looking like Likud is not really on board and for the moment, is just humoring their coalition allies as far as debating it. But if they do end up passing it, you can bet there's going to be a shitstorm in Israeli politics over it. There's going to be protests, and there's going to be a lot of consternation and concern amongst activists, in particular in the Palestinian territories, because that could well open the door to some significant abuses down the road.
Something to watch.
Something to watch.
We had a comment in the chat. Please update for Myanmar. We have a clanmate from there. I'm guessing a StarCraft clanmate.
Okay, I'll try to rush through it here because I know we don't have much time. But let's see. So the update here is not much of an update. I've basically just read an article and actually I can post that for those of you who are interested. And the article in question was more kind of a review of what the government had been doing in the latter parts of 2022. But I kind of picked out some of those items and I thought it would make a good review, because I don't think people have been following the war in Myanmar very closely. So some of this will be news to them. In just a second, let me get this to Neuro if I can find him. Oh no, I did it wrong. Here we go. Here, sent that to you in Discord. So yeah, over the last year, the military of Myanmar, which controls the country, it is the government and pretty much has been since independence in the late 1940s. And for those of you who maybe haven't been paying attention to Myanmar, there was a coup, if you can call it that. The military overthrew the civilian government. It wasn't really much of a coup because effectively the military was still in control. They never really gave it up. But nominally they had been democratizing. They had allowed democratic elections, and there was nominally a civilian government that had some control over certain areas of the country's affairs. Not foreign relations and not really internal or external security, which are pretty important areas. That stuff was still controlled by the military. But they did allow the civilian authorities to manage some stuff. But after the most recent election, the military underperformed, and it was the second election in a row in which they had done so. And so the military finally threw up its hands and basically just said, fuck it. We're not going to play this game anymore. We're just going to take over. And so then they seized control of what areas of government that they had previously ceded to the civilians. They arrested the civilian leadership, and there have been no more elections. Well, there's been no more like pretense to democracy in the country since then. Now, the result was mass protests. That was the initial reaction. But, the military has no real history of tolerating like substantive dissent. So, like they have with the previous incidences of mass unrest in Myanmar, they responded violently. So the protesters, and, it was actually really sad too, maybe even more so than usual in cases like this, because a lot of the protesters were kids who had grown up in the 10 years during which the country had had a nominal democracy. So, they had grown up thinking that the country was heading in a positive direction, was becoming more open, was democratizing, liberalizing, becoming more prosperous. The country also enjoyed a lot of foreign investment because it had opened up. And then this happened, and suddenly all of that just goes away. And so a lot of these kids were thinking, they just needed to go out and protest. They'd been influenced by, the internet, which they had access to by that point. And a lot of them were kind of disappointed and shocked that the military cracked down as hard as they did. They were kind of hoping that if they could just put enough pressure by way of protests, then the government would have to fold. And instead, they just got gunned down, like in mass. But to their credit, they didn't stop. They kept coming out, they kept challenging the police, the army, etc. They never came anywhere close to getting concessions, but they showed a lot of courage in going out and protesting, even though the government was just explicitly going out and just shooting them. So that happened for a couple months, and eventually protesters started moving out of the cities, specifically the capital, and the capital's Myitkyina now. Well, not even Myitkyina. What the hell is the capital? The capital of Myanmar used to be Rangoon, and that's still the largest city. But the military decided to build a whole new capital in the interior of the country. And I don't remember what it was called. I think it's something like Myitkyina. But regardless, the protesters moved out of the cities, and they started moving into the rural areas so that they could start training. And the idea there was that they wanted to start training to form militias and eventually an army that could take on the military and fight it. And there was a period of several months when the protests kind of died down a little bit, and you didn't really hear much from Myanmar. But during that interregnum there, the protesters were actually preparing, basically. Again, for those of you maybe not familiar with Myanmar's history, Myanmar's entire history has been plagued with civil war. And most of it has been ethnic in nature. There's a lot of ethnic minorities that live in the north of the country that don't get along with the predominant majority ethnicity in the south of the country. And almost immediately, after the country became independent in the 1940s, those minority ethnic groups formed militias and basically tried to form their own states in the north of the country. And they've basically been in a state of on again, off again war with the national government ever since. So it's been more than half a century that they've been fighting like this. And, it kind of runs hot and cold for the past 10 years. Relations between the government and the militias have been relatively good. But recently, the protesters have been going to these ethnic militias to learn how to fight. And the militias, of course, have been quite happy to abide and provide that service. It's actually really weird and interesting because most of the protesters are themselves of the majority ethnic group, the Burmese, basically. So they're going out to these people that historically their ethnic group has basically been trying to suppress. And so they've kind of been learning. A lot of them had, even the relatively liberal-minded protesters, kind of had somewhat nationalistic, antiquated, shall we say, prejudicial even, views of the ethnic minorities. But of course, once they had the common enemy, they started putting those aside. And so there's been some growth there in terms of mutual understanding. Whether that translates to any kind of greater tolerance in the future remains to be seen. But at the moment, at least, there is some hope in that regard. Regardless, the protesters started training up, and by mid-late 2022, they had started actively fighting the government. It was mostly small-scale stuff, hit-and-run attacks, that kind of thing. But it started growing in scale over time. And at this point, they're still not in a position to like eject the government from power or even really challenge substantively the army wherever it's concentrated. But they have gotten powerful enough to start controlling certain rural areas in the south, which had historically been more the military's base of support, and which is well outside of the traditional base of support for the ethnic militias in the north. So they are making headway over time. It's unclear how successful they'll be. The conflict is very violent. They do take losses. There is attrition. But for the moment, the liberal rebels, that's a weird phrase, isn't it? Liberal rebels, but that is what they are. Liberal rebels in Burma seem to be able to continue operations. They seem to be able to replace their losses, etc. So there is hope there for success yet, but it's going to take time. The military is very strongly ensconced in power. They do have some support. Their network, it's an extended patronage network, effectively, is pretty extensive. It's not just like a couple elites, but pretty much anybody who works in the military does get disproportionate access to benefits and money. And in a poor country like Burma, that carries a lot of weight. So that's a big headwind there for the rebels. But at the same time, the government has also greatly delegitimized itself because of its violence. Even in areas that have traditionally supported the military, they've delegitimized themselves by being so violent. Because they're dealing with hit and run rebels who hide in the countryside, and so that means they have to wage a counterinsurgency campaign. And as anybody who's fought in Iraq can tell you, that's really hard. It's easier if you're a national government, but in this case, they're kind of squandering their advantage by just being overly brutal and alienating the local population. So that's creating a lot of recruits and support and financial aid for the rebels that they would not have had otherwise. So that's a rough review of what's been happening, or well, not what's been happening, but a rough review of the conflict thus far. So some of the more recent developments over the second half of 2022 here, outlined in the article. There's been a number of executions, at least 4 pro-democracy leaders, including a former parliamentarian, all executed. The government had been refraining from executing leaders of the opposition. They had just been keeping them under arrest. In Aung Suu Kyi's case, house arrest. She was recently given like a 30-some year sentence for something, so they're definitely keeping her locked down. But some of the other leaders have now been executed. They're not holding back on some of them. So it seems like the regime is getting more violent here as the conflict drags out. There was also other leaders, including university student leaders, who were shot to death. Well, maybe not shot to death. They were executed. I presume that means firing squad, given that it's the military, but maybe some other means. Let's see. And the military has also torched the home village of the country's first ever Catholic cardinal, a guy named Charles Mong Bo. And that may have been a deliberate warning, because he'd been a pretty outspoken activist, apparently. Difficult to say. But in doing so, they killed 7 civilians, including a 9-year-old boy, apparently. So again, just illustrating the brutality of the military and how they signal through violence and not through, warnings or other forms of coercion. Like the military is not afraid to go after people violently. There's also been dozens of airstrikes hitting villages around the country. Like I mentioned before, the rebels have been more successful in the rural areas recently. And so the government has been very violent in trying to discourage and dissuade villagers from supporting them. And some of that comes in the form of just sending soldiers to burn down a village or what have you. But they have also been doing airstrikes, obviously. Yeah, I don't know that the Burmese Air Force is all that big, so I don't know how much damage they can really do. But, if you're just bombing villages, you don't need a B-52. Just a small two-seater will do the job. Let's see, there's about 13,000 political prisoners at this point still in jail. And then, of course, thousands of people killed or otherwise dislocated by the conflict. So, like I said, that's a very short update. That's basically just highlights from that one article. But those interested in the topic, I would definitely encourage to read that. I sent it to Neuro in Discord. I'm sure he can share it with you guys if you want.
Yeah, I linked it in Twitch chat. Also
Yeah,
looked up
thank you.
the capital. It's Naypyidaw.
Naypyidaw. Okay. Yeah, I thought I was getting it wrong because Myitkyina was actually the site of a battle in World War II.
Mm.
So that's what kept coming to mind. Naypyidaw or Naypyidaw?
Myitkyina is in the north of Myanmar.
Yeah. Yeah, that was where. Sorry?
Naypyidaw.
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 Yeah, that's a whole new city that they built from scratch. I don't think there was hardly anything up there before they moved to the capital.
Hmm.
Yeah, and probably they were just doing it so they could embezzle money. Whenever you have a big project like that, it always creates opportunities for corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Nominally, the military justified it by saying they wanted the capital to be more secure. Because Rangoon is on the coast, it's a port city. It was
Mm-hmm.
obviously vulnerable to anybody who has any kind of navy.
Mm-hmm.
But by having the capital in the interior of the country, it's much harder to get to. So presumably safer, more of a buffer zone between the
Mm-hmm.
capital in that case and anybody who wants to attack. But I suspect that was just bullshit.
Yeah. Kind of like Brasilia, maybe? In
Well,
Brazil?
Brasilia wasn't bullshit. I mean, that was a genuine attempt to try to create a new capital that was more centrally located
Mm.
so that it was easier for people in the more sparsely, some of the more further reaches of the country to get to. Because before the capital had been Rio? Was it Rio de Janeiro? I feel like I'm getting that wrong. If we have anybody who knows, let me know in chat. It was on the coast regardless.
Mm.
So most of the population lived on the coast, so that wasn't too much of a problem. But as the population expanded inland, it got to be more of an inconvenience.
Yeah, Burma, I think, is the English name of the country, and Myanmar is the translation in their language.
Myanmar is actually the English name because they actually did change it in international forums.
Oh.
That is to say, the government went out of their way and said, all of you need to call us by this new name. So that is the official name of the country, Myanmar.
Hmm.
But a lot of people still call it Burma,
Mm-hmm.
which was the old name because they don't really recognize the legitimacy of the government there, the military specifically.
Ah.
So some people still call it Burma, some
Just to
people
piss
still
them
call it
off.
Myanmar. Yeah, pretty much. That's pretty much the gist of it.
That's so brutal, though. Like, thinking about how much we protest in the U.S. about all kinds of different stuff, and how usually there are cops that show up, and sometimes they do get a little bit overly violent, but I don't really know of that many recent protests where they just start shooting at us. That's crazy.
We had Kent State. There was that one, but that was pretty much an isolated incident.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think anything like that has really happened since then. Yeah, Myanmar was having a Kent State every day for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope they can overcome this and get some democracy going again.
Some actual democracy,
Yeah.
preferably. Preferably without the genocide, although that wasn't really all their fault. The military kind of went out of their way to milk that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had on it.
Well, cool. Appreciate the breakdown as always. If we messed anything up during the segment, feel free to give a raging, scathing review in the YouTube comments, correct us, because we're trying to figure out what's going on here, just like you guys. So this is meant to be a conversation. For the next one, same thing. We can do corrections and that kind of stuff. The chat was, I think, relatively pleasant today. People didn't get too upset. The U.S. news stuff. I would say last time we talked about Twitter, that got some people pretty fired up. That's a spicy one. But talking about the Twitter think tanks, people didn't really poop their pants about that one. They were like, oh yeah, what about this one? What about that one? Oh, I think I still have that tab open. Someone linked Agent Smith and who he was following, because that would be kind of like where he's getting his news from. So if you want to look at the source and see, here we go, I got the link. If you want to see if he's misinterpreting things or interpreting them very well.
Yeah, make sure to check out Neuro, because I think I think I do follow you on there.
Yeah. Yeah,
You
I
should
don't
be on the
tweet
list.
super often. I'm at the top of the list. I think maybe you made the Twitter account after we started doing this segment.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I didn't really start doing think tanks on Twitter for until relatively recently. I think the past year or so, year and change. It was part of a general shift, a purposeful shift on my part in terms of my media consumption.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to find better quality stuff. You can't read everything, but you can try to make the stuff that you do read higher quality so you get the most for your time spent reading it.
Very true. And for people consuming stuff, I would challenge you to try to see what they're trying to get people to think so that you don't just get swayed and you don't realize it. Persuasion and influence is definitely a part of how we communicate, and it's important to, in a lot of cases, persuade someone that their way is wrong and there's a better way to do something. But that should hold up under scrutiny. And a lot of people who have a platform to talk, they can just say whatever the fuck they want to, and it doesn't actually hold up under scrutiny, but they have a lot of charisma. So be informed, double check your sources, and check to see if other information kind of points toward the same truth if you can.
Good advice.
Hell yeah. Well, appreciate you coming on, as always, to another Will discussion. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling the questions, and thank you, chat, for contributing to the conversation. And we will see you all on the next episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice. First 2023 episode. Boom, boom. Thanks, Ripley, for guarding the fireplace. Appreciate that. That's a pupper. This is my parents' dog. We had to get the dog tag thing blurred out because it had a phone number on it.